In the harsh fjords of 9th century Norway, where survival depends on strength and conquest rules all, an unlikely bond forms between two souls forever changed by war. Astrid lost everything when Viking raiders destroyed her village, leaving her with nothing but grief and the clothes on her back. Leif built his fortune commanding the very ships that brought such devastation to coastal settlements. When their paths cross in a bustling port city, neither expects what follows. She begs for scraps while he commands respect and wealth beyond measure. Yet guilt weighs heavier than gold, and recognition cuts deeper than any blade. What happens when the architect of destruction meets the survivor of his greatest conquest? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog rolled off the North Sea like the breath of sleeping giants, carrying with it the scent of salt, seaweed, and the lingering smoke from a dozen cooking fires. Astrid pulled her torn cloak tighter around her shoulders as she made her way through the narrow streets of Stavanger's port district. The fabric, once a deep blue like summer twilight, had faded to the color of old bruises fitting, she thought, for someone whose life had become a collection of wounds that refused to heal. 3 months had passed since the waves had deposited her more dead than alive onto these foreign shores. 3 months since she had awakened on a rocky beach with no memory of how she had survived when everyone she loved had perished. The torn cloak had been her only companion then, wrapped around her like a shroud, heavy with seawater and the weight of unbearable loss. Now it served a different purpose. In a world where strength commanded respect and weakness invited predation, the cloak helped her blend into the shadows, to move unseen among the merchants and warriors who controlled this bustling hub of trade and warfare. She had learned quickly that invisibility was survival. Her stomach cramped with familiar hunger as she approached the fish market. The vendors were setting up their stalls, arranging their silver catches on beds of kelp, the scales catching the early light like scattered coins. Astrid had discovered that this was the best time to search for scraps before the day's business began in earnest, when a dropped fish or a handful of unsold goods from the previous day might be overlooked. "Away with you, beggar woman," barked Halvard the fishmonger, a broad man whose hands were permanently stained with fish blood and salt. He had grown tired of her daily presence, though she never asked for anything directly. "You bring bad luck to honest trade." Astrid said nothing, merely stepped back into the morning shadows. She had learned that words only drew unwanted attention, and attention brought trouble. Instead, she waited and watched, noting which stalls threw their refuse where, which merchants might be careless with their goods. The port city was a maze of contradictions that never ceased to amaze her. Wealth and poverty existed side by side, sometimes separated by nothing more than the width of a narrow alley. Norse jarls counted their silver, while thralls hauled cargo with bent backs and hopeless eyes. Ships arrived daily, bringing goods from distant lands, amber from the Baltic, furs from the northern forests, iron and silver from mines she couldn't imagine. Yet for all this abundance, Astrid survived on scraps and the occasional kindness of strangers, who saw something in her eyes that reminded them of their own losses. She had been born to a different world, one where her father had been a respected fisherman and her mother known throughout their village for her skill with healing herbs. Their settlement had been small but prosperous, nestled in a protected cove where the fishing was good and the land fertile enough for barley and turnips. Astrid had expected to marry young Eric from the neighboring farm, to raise children who would learn the old ways, to grow old watching the same sunsets her grandmother had watched. That world had ended on a day that had started like any other. The memory still came to her in fragments, like pieces of a shattered pot that could never be made whole again, the sound of horns echoing across the water, her mother's sharp intake of breath as she recognized the war cry of the Einwolf clan. The sight of dragon-prowed ships cutting through the morning mist, their red and black shields gleaming like the scales of some terrible sea serpent. Her father had grabbed his fishing spear, knowing it was useless against trained warriors, but unable to die without fighting for his family. Her youngest brother, barely 16, had tried to rally the other young men to defend the women and children. Her mother had pressed a small pouch of healing herbs into Astrid's hands and whispered urgent words about hiding in the root cellar until the danger passed, but there had been no hiding from what came next. The Einwolf raiders had not come for silver or thralls. They had come to send a message. Their leader, a chieftain with ice-blue eyes and braided beard shot through with gray, had ordered every building burned, every person killed. No survivors, no witnesses. The attack had been swift and merciless, a demonstration of power that would echo across the coastal settlements for seasons to come. Astrid should have died with the others, would have preferred to die with the others. Instead, some cruel twist of fate had spared her. When the smoke cleared and the raiders departed, she had emerged from the ruins to find her world transformed into a landscape of ash and blood. Her parents, her brothers, young Eric with his gentle smile all gone, leaving her alone among the smoldering remains of everything she had ever known. The details of her escape remained clouded in the fog of shock and grief. She remembered stumbling to the shore, remembered finding a piece of driftwood large enough to support her weight, remembered the cold embrace of the sea as she allowed the current to carry her away from the horror behind her. Days had blurred together in a haze of sun and salt spray until she had washed ashore here, in this place where no one knew her name or cared about her story. Now she moved through Stavanger like a ghost, sustained by stubbornness and the inexplicable belief that there must be some purpose to her survival. The other beggars, mostly old men broken by war or women, whose husbands had died in raids, had taught her the unspoken rules of their shadow world. Where to find shelter when the storms came, which merchants might offer a day's work in exchange for bread. How to stay invisible to the Jarls and their warriors, who saw poverty as a personal failing worthy of contempt. Yet even in this reduced existence, Astrid found herself drawn to the harbor, where the great ships came and went like migrating birds. She told herself it was practical. The docks were always busy, offering opportunities for work or forgotten cargo. But deeper than pragmatism was a fascination she couldn't name, a need to understand the vessels that carried such power to destroy and create. It was there, among the forest of masts and the maze of rigging, that she first became aware of him, Leif, though she wouldn't learn his name for some time, yet commanded attention without demanding it. He moved through the shipyard with the confident stride of someone who belonged, who had earned his place through skill rather than birthright alone. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched by premature silver at the temples, he carried himself like a warrior, but spoke with the measured tone of a craftsman. His shipyard occupied a prime position along the harbor's southern edge, where the deep water allowed even the largest vessels to dock directly at his piers. The compound buzzed with constant activity: carpenters shaping oak ribs, blacksmiths forging iron fittings, rope makers spinning their endless coils of hemp and hair. The air rang with the sound of hammers and saws, punctuated by shouted instructions in 3 different languages. Astrid found herself returning again and again to watch the work, drawn by something she couldn't articulate. Perhaps it was the sight of creation rather than destruction, the way raw timber was transformed into vessels capable of carrying men across vast oceans. Or perhaps it was Leif himself, the way he moved among his workers with easy authority, solving problems with quiet efficiency, treating his craftsmen with a respect she rarely saw among the Norse elite. She learned his routines without intending to. He arrived each morning before dawn, often carrying a leather satchel that contained the tools of his trade, measuring cords, marking knives, and most prominently, a bronze compass that caught the early light like a small sun. The compass seemed to be his most prized possession, worn smooth by years of handling, its needle pointing true north with unwavering certainty. From her hiding places among the cargo stacks and coiled ropes, Astrid observed the careful choreography of shipbuilding. She watched Leif select each piece of timber personally, running his hands along the grain, checking for weaknesses that might prove fatal in a storm. She saw him work alongside his men, his expensive clothes stained with sawdust and pitch, his hands as calloused as any common laborer's. But she also noticed the subtle signs of wealth and status that marked him as something more than a simple craftsman. The quality of his wool cloak, dyed the deep red that spoke of expensive cochineal, the silver arm rings that marked his prosperity, the deference shown him by merchants and yawls alike when they came to commission new vessels. Most telling of all were the ships themselves. Leif's vessels were renowned throughout the Norse lands for their speed and seaworthiness, but also for their capacity for destruction. The long ships that slid down his launching ramps were built for war as much as exploration. Their shallow drafts perfect for sudden raids on coastal settlements, their high prows designed to strike fear into the hearts of those who saw them approaching through morning mist. It was a bare irony that Astrid found herself fascinated by the man whose craftsmanship had likely enabled her family's destruction. Every ship that left his yard carried the potential for tragedy, each perfectly balanced hull and cunningly designed sail, a tool that could bring death to some distant shore. Yet she couldn't deny the artistry in his work, the way he coaxed grace and power from seasoned oak and twisted iron. The workers in Leif's shipyard came from many lands escaped thralls seeking a new life, younger sons of minor jarls looking to learn a trade, even a few foreign craftsmen whose exotic skills commanded high wages. They formed a community of sorts, bound together by their shared dedication to their demanding craft. Astrid envied them their purpose, their place in a world that made sense. Her own existence had become a daily struggle for the basic necessities of survival. Food was always uncertain. A piece of stale bread here, a bowl of thin soup there. Occasionally, a fish head or handful of grain swept from a merchant's cart. Shelter was equally precarious. In good weather, she slept in doorways or under the overturned hulls of damaged boats. When storms came, she sought refuge in the spaces beneath the dock pilings, huddled with the rats and the dampness, listening to the waves crash overhead. The other beggars had their own hierarchies and territories, their own unspoken rules about sharing information and resources. Old Magnus, who had lost his right arm in a sea battle 20 years past, controlled the best spots near the taverns where drunk sailors might be generous with their coins. Helga, whose mind had been touched by some long-ago grief, claimed the area around the temples where the pious sometimes felt moved to charity. Astrid's territory was the harbor itself, which suited her well enough. The constant activity provided cover for her presence, and the merchants were often too busy to notice one more figure moving among the shadows. She had become expert at reading the rhythms of trade, knowing when a ship would arrive heavy with goods and when it might depart with holds only half full. It was this knowledge that had taught her to recognize the signs of wealth and poverty, success and desperation in the faces of those who came to do business at the port. She could spot a prosperous merchant by the quality of his sea boots, identify a ship's captain by the way other men stepped aside for him, recognize a warrior by the casual way he wore his weapons. And she had learned to recognize the look that crossed certain faces when they thought no one was watching, the expression of men who carried weight beyond mere responsibility, who bore the burden of decisions that had changed lives and ended them. It was that look she saw sometimes on Leif's face when he stood alone at the end of his longest pier, staring out at the horizon with his bronze compass in his hands. In those moments, He seemed older than his years, worn by something heavier than physical labor. His success and reputation seemed to sit uneasily on his shoulders. As if prosperity had come at a cost, he was still calculating. Astrid wondered what ghosts haunted his quiet moments. What memories might trouble the sleep of a man who built the instruments of other men's ambitions? She knew nothing of his history, his family, or the path that had brought him to his current position. But something in his manner suggested that his hands, skilled as they were at creating beautiful and deadly things, had not always been used. For construction alone, winter was approaching, and with it the knowledge that survival would become even more challenging. The nights were growing longer and colder, the storms more frequent and severe. The harbor would ice over in the coldest months, bringing the shipping season to a halt, and with it many of the opportunities for scraps and occasional work that sustained her. Astrid knew she needed to find a more permanent solution to her situation before the snows came in earnest. But she also knew that options for a woman alone, with no family connections or marketable skills beyond a basic knowledge of herbal healing, were severely limited. She could try to attach herself to one of the households as a servant, accepting whatever protection and sustenance might come with such a position. She could attempt to join one of the religious communities that sometimes offered shelter to the desperate. Or she could simply accept that she might not survive another winter and find some peace in the knowledge that she would soon rejoin those she had lost. Yet something in her refused to surrender to despair. Perhaps it was the memory of her mother's final words about the healing herbs, the suggestion that knowledge could be its own form of strength. Perhaps it was simple stubbornness, the same quality that had kept her swimming when the current tried to drag her under. Or perhaps it was the growing certainty that her survival, unlikely as it seemed, meant something, that she had been preserved for some purpose not yet revealed. As the morning fog began to lift and the day's commerce got underway, Astrid retreated to her usual watching place among the stacked cargo barrels. Soon Leif would emerge from his private workshop, compass in hand, ready to begin another day of transforming dreams and ambitions into vessels that could carry men across the wine-dark sea. She settled in to watch and wait, as she had every day for the past month, unaware that this day would be different from all the others that had come before. The bronze compass caught the afternoon light as Leif examined the latest measurements for the longship taking shape on the central stocks. The vessel was nearly complete, 60 feet of perfectly shaped oak that would soon carry Earl Gunnar's warriors on their spring raids. Every line was precise, every joint sealed with the care that had made Leif's reputation unassailable throughout the Norse lands. Yet today, the familiar satisfaction of craftsmanship completed felt hollow in his chest. "Master Leif," called Bjorn, his senior carpenter, wiping sawdust from his graying beard. "The steering oar assembly is ready for your inspection." Leif nodded, tucking the compass into his leather pouch before following Bjorn to where the massive steering oar lay across 2 wooden horses. The work was flawless, as he had expected, the blade carved to precise dimensions, the shaft smooth and straight as an arrow, the complex joint that would allow it to pivot under extreme pressure crafted with the skill of a master. "Good work," he said, running his hand along the polished wood. "Earl Gunnar will be pleased." But even as he spoke the words, Leif felt the familiar weight settling on his shoulders. Earl Gunnar would indeed be pleased, and come spring, this beautiful instrument of his craft would slice through foreign waters towards some distant shore where families slept peacefully, unaware of what dawn might bring. The thought had been troubling him more frequently of late, creeping into his mind during the quiet hours when his hands worked automatically and his thoughts were free to wander. How many villages had felt the bite of blades carried in vessels of his making? How many children had watched their fathers die at the hands of warriors who had arrived in ships bearing his craftsmanship? "Master," Bjorn's voice broke through his reverie, "there's something you should see." The older man's tone carried an unusual note of concern. Leif followed him to the storage building where finished components awaited assembly, noting how his carpenter's usual confident stride had become hesitant. Inside the dim building, Bjorn led him to a corner where several wooden chests contained various items recovered from damaged ship salvage that sometimes proved useful for repairs or provided examples of foreign craftsmanship. It was practical to study the work of other shipbuilders, to understand their techniques and innovations. I was sorting through the chest from that burned Frisian trader, Bjorn explained, his voice careful and measured. Looking for iron fittings we might reuse. Found this wrapped in oiled leather. He held out a piece of metal that made Leif's breath catch in his throat. It was a shield boss, the central iron dome that formed the backbone of a warrior's protection. But this one bore distinctive markings that Leif recognized with sickening clarity. The wolf's head etched into the surface, surrounded by the interlaced patterns that marked it as belonging to the Iron Wolf clan. More specifically, it belonged to the raiding party that Leif had personally guided to a small fishing village 3 months earlier. "There's more," Bjorn said quietly, clearly uncomfortable with what he was revealing. "Scraps of cloth, some carved bone buttons. Personal effects, it looks like." Leif took the shield boss with hands that remained steady through sheer force of will. The metal was cold and heavy, stained with something that might have been rust, but which they both knew was more likely dried blood. Along one edge, a section had been crushed inward. Speaking of tremendous force, perhaps the blow that had ended its owner's life. Where did this chest come from? Leif asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "The Frisian trader that burned and went down off the Skull Rocks last month," Bjorn replied. "The one that was carrying salvage and refugees from the coastal raids. We bought what cargo could be recovered, remember? Thought there might be valuable goods mixed in with the trade items. Of course, the same storm that had likely deposited the beggar woman on their shores had also claimed the Frisian vessel. Refugees fleeing the very destruction that Leif's ships had enabled would have carried whatever precious remnants they could, save, including, apparently, this shield that had belonged to a brother, a father, a son who had died defending his home. "Burn it," Leif said quietly. "All of it. We have no need for such things." But Bjorn shook his head slowly. "There's something else, master. Someone who needs to see this first." "What do you mean?" "The beggar woman. The one who watches the yard from the cargo stacks. I've seen her looking at this building, like she's searching for something. And when I pulled this from the chest, he gestured at the shield boss. There was recognition in her eyes. She was standing in the doorway, just for a moment, before she disappeared again." Leif's stomach dropped. The woman he had noticed moving like a shadow through his shipyard, the one whose presence had begun to disturb his carefully ordered world in ways he couldn't explain. If she had seen the shield boss, if it meant something to her, you think she's connected to this somehow? "I think she's connected to whatever happened to the people who owned these things," Bjorn said carefully. "And I think she's been watching us for reasons that have nothing to do with looking for work or scraps." The implications settled over Leif like a cold fog. If the woman was a survivor of one of the raids his ships had supported, if she had somehow traced the connection back to his shipyard, then her presence here took on an entirely different meaning. She wasn't just another desperate refugee seeking survival. She was someone with a claim against him that no amount of silver could settle. "Where is she now?" he asked. "Gone, like smoke. But she'll be back. They always come back. The ones who are looking for something specific." Leif stared at the shield boss, its wolf's head etching seeming to snarl up at him accusingly. In his hands, he held proof of his complicity in someone's private apocalypse, evidence of the price others had paid for his prosperity. The weight of it seemed to drag at his very bones. "Leave me," he said quietly. I need to think. Bjorn hesitated, clearly wanting to offer counsel or comfort, but recognizing the mood that had settled over his master. What should I tell the men about tomorrow's work? Continue as planned. This changes nothing about our obligations. But even as he spoke the words, Leif knew they weren't true. This changed everything. Alone in the storage building, he found himself examining the other salvaged items with new eyes. A wooden comb carved with intricate knotwork, a bone needle case, a child's leather shoe, small enough to fit in his palm. Each item represented a life disrupted, a story ended, a family scattered to the winds. He had always known, in the abstract, that his ships enabled destruction as well as exploration. That was the nature of the world they lived, in strength, took from weakness. The bold claimed what the cautious couldn't defend. It was the way of things, as natural and inevitable as winter following autumn. But abstract knowledge was different, from holding the physical remnants of that destruction in his hands. Different from knowing that somewhere in his prosperous shipyard moved a woman who had lost everything the violence his craftsmanship had made possible. The bronze compass seemed to grow heavier in his pouch as he stood surrounded by the ghosts of his choices. For years, it had been his most trusted tool, guiding him through the complexities of design and navigation with unwavering certainty. Now it felt like an accusation, its true pointing needle a reminder that some directions once taken could never be retraced. Outside, he could hear the familiar sounds of his shipyard winding down for the evening. His workers calling their farewells, the last hammers falling silent, the watchman beginning his rounds. Soon the compound would be empty, except for the guards. Quiet, except for the gentle lapping of waves against the hulls of unfinished vessels. It was then, in the gathering dusk, that he saw her. She moved between the shadows, like something that belonged to them, her torn cloak making her nearly invisible against the darkened buildings. But Leif's eyes had grown accustomed to searching for her presence, and he spotted her making her way toward the storage building with the purposeful stride of someone who had been waiting for this moment. He could have called for the guards, could have had her removed from his property and warned never to return. Instead, he found himself stepping deeper into the shadows, waiting to see what she would do. She approached the building carefully, checking to ensure she was unobserved, unaware that the very man she sought already watched from the darkness. At the doorway, she paused, her head tilted as if listening for sounds from within. Then, with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to moving unseen, she slipped inside. Leif followed, his own footsteps silent on the packed earth floor. Inside, he could see her silhouette moving among the stacked goods, her attention focused on the corner where Bjorn had made his discovery. She seemed to know exactly what she was looking for. When she found the wooden chest, a sharp intake of breath was audible in the stillness. She knelt beside it, her hands trembling as she reached for the shield boss that Leif had lying on top of the other salvaged items. "That belonged to someone you knew," he said quietly. She spun toward his voice, her body coiled like a spring, ready to flee. In the dim light filtering through the building's small windows, he could see her face clearly, for the first time younger than he had expected, marked by hardship, but not yet broken by it. Her eyes held a depth of pain that he recognized, having seen it reflected in his own mirror during his darkest moments. "You know who I am," she said. Her voice was steady despite her obvious tension, carrying an accent that placed her from the northern coastal regions. "And I know who you are, Leif Erikson, builder of the ships that carry death to peaceful shores." "I build ships," he replied carefully. "What men do with them is their choice, not mine. Your ships carried the Iron Wolf, raiders to my village." She held up the shield boss, its wolf's head etching visible even in the poor light. "This belonged to my brother Olaf. He was 16 when he tried to defend our home against warriors who came in vessels of your making." The simple statement hit Leif with more force than any accusation could have. Here was the price of his success. Given a name and a face, the abstract concept of collateral damage transformed into a young woman holding the remnant of her murdered family. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, and meant it more deeply than any words he had ever spoken. "Sorry?" Her laugh was bitter as winter wind. "You're sorry? Do you know what your sorrow is worth to someone who has nothing left?" "No," he admitted. "I don't." She stood slowly, the shield boss still clutched in her hands. "I had parents. 2 brothers. A man I was going to marry come summer. A home where my grandmother's grandmother was born. I had a name that meant something. A place in the world, a future that made sense." Her voice remained controlled, but Leif could see the effort it cost her. "Now I have this torn cloak and the memory of their screams. What do you want from me?" he asked. The question seemed to surprise her, as if she had expected denials or explanations rather than direct acknowledgement of his role in her tragedy. "I don't know," she said finally. "I've been watching you for weeks, trying to decide. Trying to understand how someone can create such beautiful things and such terrible consequences with the same hands. I've been wondering the same thing myself." She studied his face in the dim light, perhaps searching for signs of deception or manipulation. "Have you? Or is that just something you tell yourself to sleep better at night?" "I don't sleep well," Leif said quietly. "I haven't for months." They stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by the physical remnants of violence and the invisible weight of shared guilt and grief. Outside, the evening wind was picking up, whistling through the gaps in the building's walls with a sound like distant weeping. "What's your name?" he asked. "Astrid Eriksdotter." She paused, then added with bitter irony, "Though I suppose that name means nothing now since there's no Erik left to be daughter to." "Astrid," he repeated, tasting the syllables. "It means divine star. My mother chose it because I was born during the winter solstice, when the stars burn brightest against the dark." Her grip tightened on the shield boss. She said it meant I would be a light in dark places. Perhaps you are. What light is there in begging for scraps and sleeping in doorways? What light is there in surviving when everyone you love is dead? Leif had no answer for that. No words of comfort that wouldn't sound hollow and false. Instead, he found himself saying something that surprised them both. "Stay." "What? Don't disappear again? I have a proposal for you." Astrid's eyes narrowed with suspicion. What kind of proposal? "Work, food, a roof over your head." He paused, knowing that his next words would commit him to a path he couldn't foresee. "And answers to whatever questions you have about the choices I've made." "Why would you offer that?" "Because you're right about the ships I build and the consequences of my choices. Because your brother's shield in my storage building is an accusation I can't answer and can't ignore." He met her eyes steadily. "And because I think we might both be carrying more guilt than any one person should bear alone." Astrid stared at him for a long moment, clearly struggling with conflicting impulses. The offer represented safety and sustenance, resources she desperately needed as winter approached, but it also meant accepting help from the man whose work had enabled her family's destruction, entering into some form of relationship with the architect of her grief. "I don't forgive you," she said finally. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to understand what my choices have cost, and perhaps to find a way to make choices that cost less. And you think I can help you with that?" "I think you're the only one who can." She looked down at the shield boss in her hands, its metal surface reflecting the last traces of daylight filtering through the windows. When she looked up again, her expression had changed, not softened exactly, but become more complex, as if she was seeing possibilities she hadn't considered before. "I won't pretend to be grateful," she warned. "And I won't pretend that working for you makes us even. I wouldn't expect you to. And I want to keep this." She held up the shield boss. "It's all I have left of my brother. Of course. Astrid nodded slowly, as if making a decision that would reshape both their futures. Then yes, I'll stay. But not because I forgive you, and not because I think you're a good man trying to make amends. Then why? Because you're right about one thing: we both have more guilt than we can carry alone. And because I'm tired of being invisible, of surviving without living. She straightened her shoulders, and for a moment, Leif glimpsed the woman she might have been in a different world, one where her future hadn't been written in blood and ash. If I'm going to live, I want to understand why I survived when they didn't. And I think those answers might be found here, in this place where destruction begins. As they stood facing each other in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the tools and remnants of their shared tragedy, neither could have predicted how profoundly this moment would reshape both their lives. The shield boss gleamed between them, like a tarnished star, a symbol of endings that might also herald unexpected beginnings. The servants' quarters behind Leif's main house smelled of pine logs and wool, a stark contrast to the damp stone and rotting kelp that had been Astrid's shelter for the past months. The room was simple but clean: a narrow bed with woolen blankets, a wooden chest for belongings she didn't have, and a small window that looked out over the shipyard, where the day's work was already beginning. Astrid sat on the edge of the bed, her brother's shield boss resting in her lap, and tried to understand what she had agreed to. The morning light streaming through the window illuminated the torn cloak she still wore, making it look even more bedraggled against the relative comfort of her new surroundings. Everything felt surreal, as if she had stepped into someone else's life by mistake. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Astrid? Leif's voice was carefully neutral, the tone of a man uncertain of his welcome. May I come in? She considered refusing, asserting some small measure of control over her circumstances, but pragmatism won over pride. Yes. He entered carrying a wooden tray laden with more food than she had seen in one place for months, fresh bread still warm from the oven, butter, honey, dried fish, and a clay cup steaming with what smelled like spiced ale. The sight of it made her stomach clench with desperate hunger, but she forced herself to remain still. I thought you might be hungry, he said, setting the tray on the small table beside the window. My housekeeper, Sigrid, prepared this. She'll be responsible for your meals and helping you settle in. Sigrid, Astrid repeated, testing the name. Does she know who I am? What I am. She knows you're someone who needs help, and that you'll be working in the household. Nothing more. Leif paused, his hand resting on the door handle. The choice of what to tell others about your past is yours to make. It was a small kindness, but one that allowed her to preserve some dignity. Astrid nodded her acknowledgement, then found herself asking the question that had kept her awake through the night. What kind of work? We'll figure that out together. For now, rest and eat. The shipyard isn't going anywhere. After he left, Astrid stared at the food for a long moment before her body's needs overcame her mental reservations. The bread was soft and flavorful, the butter rich and sweet, the fish perfectly smoked. Each bite felt like a small betrayal of her family's memory. Comfort purchased with the blood of those she had loved, but she ate anyway, because survival demanded it, and because some part of her recognized that starving herself to death wouldn't honor their sacrifice or punish Leif for his role in their destruction. It would simply be another victory for the violence that had already taken too much. The sound of voices outside her window drew her attention as she finished the meal. Leif's workers were gathering for the morning assignment of tasks, their conversation carrying clearly in the crisp air. Heard the masters taking in another stray, one voice was saying, tinged with amusement. Found her scrounging around the storage buildings. Another thrall, you think? This from a younger man whose accent marked him as foreign-born. Easy. Been softer lately about taking in refugees. Not a thrall, replied the first voice, which Astrid recognized as belonging to Born, the senior carpenter. Something else. Someone who's been watching the yard for weeks. Watching for what? That's what makes it interesting, isn't it? Astrid moved closer to the window, careful to stay hidden behind the wooden shutter. Below, she could see a group of perhaps a dozen men gathered around Bourne, their faces showing varying degrees of curiosity and suspicion. These were the people she would have to live and work among, men whose livelihoods depended on the same violence that had destroyed her world. Should we be concerned? The young foreign worker again, his tone more serious now. If she's been watching us, maybe she's working for competitors, stealing trade secrets. Or maybe she's just desperate, said another voice, older and more gravelly. You've all seen how bad things have gotten for people with no family, no connections. The master's got a soft heart for strays. Soft heart will get him killed someday, muttered someone from the back of the group. Mark my words. Bjorn's voice cut through the murmurs with quiet authority. The master's decisions are his own to make. Our job is to build ships, not question his hospitality. Anyone who has a problem with that can find work elsewhere. The group began to disperse, but Astrid caught fragments of continued conversation speculation about her origins, concerns about security, and the underlying tension. That came from introducing an unknown element into a well-established community. She was an outsider here in ways that went beyond her recent arrival. Someone whose very presence disrupted the careful balance Leif had created among his workers. A different knock at her door, lighter and more confident than Leif's hesitant approach, announced the arrival of Sigrid. The housekeeper was a woman of perhaps 50 years, with graying braids wound around her head and the competent bearing of someone accustomed to managing household affairs without supervision. Good, you've eaten, Sigrid said, surveying the empty tray with approval. Master Leif asked me to see about finding you proper clothes. Can't have you working in those rags. Astrid looked down at her torn cloak and the stained dress beneath. It garments that had once been respectable, but now marked her as clearly as a brand. I have no way to pay for new clothes. Payment is between you and the master. My job is to make sure you don't frighten the customers or shame the household. Sigrid's tone was brisk but not unkind. Come with me. The housekeeper led her through the main house, a substantial building of timber and stone that spoke of prosperity earned rather than inherited. The rooms were well furnished but not ostentatious, with the practical beauty of quality craftsmanship. Carved wooden beams, woolen tapestries in rich colors, and furniture built to last generations rather than merely impress. In a storage room off the main hall, Sigrid opened a large wooden chest and began sorting through its contents. These belonged to the master's sister before she married and moved to Denmark. Close to your size, I think. She held up a dress of deep green wool, simple in design but well made, with embroidered trim that caught the light. It was the kind of garment Astrid might have owned in her previous life. Practical but pretty, suitable for a respectable woman of modest means. I can't, Astrid said, her throat tightening unexpectedly. It's too much. Sigrid paused in her sorting, her sharp eyes studying Astrid's face with the perception of someone who had seen many kinds of human distress. Child, whatever brought you to our door wearing rags and carrying that haunted look in your eyes, it's in the past. The master's offered you a place here, and that means you represent this household now. You'll dress appropriately, eat regularly, and conduct yourself with dignity. That's not charity, it's requirement. The firmness in her voice was oddly comforting, removing the burden of choice from Astrid's shoulders. She nodded mutely and allowed Sigrid to help her out of her old clothes and into the green dress. The wool was soft against her skin, warm and clean-smelling, and the fit was nearly perfect. Better, Sigrid pronounced. Now, about your hair. Astrid's hand went instinctively to her tangled locks, which had grown wild and unkempt during her months of survival. In her former life, she had taken pride in her appearance. braiding her hair with ribbons and keeping it neat and shining. Now it was a matted reminder of how far she had fallen. Under Sigurd's capable hands, the tangles were worked out and the worst of the damage trimmed away. What remained was shorter than before, but healthy, framing her face in a way that made her look less like a refugee and more like the young woman she had once been. "There," Sigurd said, stepping back to admire her work. "Now you look like someone who belongs in a respectable household." But even as Astrid appreciated the kindness, part of her recoiled at how easily her exterior could be transformed. The green dress and neat hair felt like a disguise, a way of hiding the truth of what she had become. The woman looking back at her from Sigurd's polished metal mirror was a stranger wearing her face. "The master wants to see you when you're ready," Sigurd continued, gathering up Astrid's old clothes. "He's in his workshop, planning the day's work. What should I do with these?" Astrid asked, indicating her torn cloak and stained dress. "Burn them," Sigurd said, without hesitation. "You're starting fresh here. No point in carrying reminders of harder times." But Astrid shook her head, taking the bundle of worn fabric from the housekeeper's hands. "No, I need to keep them." Sigurd's expression softened slightly. "As you wish. That they stay in your room, out of sight. No good comes from dwelling too much on what's past." Astrid made her way to Leif's workshop with careful steps, still adjusting to the feeling of clean wool against her skin and the weight of hair that didn't hang in tangled ropes around her face. The other workers she passed gave her curious looks, some nodding politely when she met their eyes. She was no longer invisible, no longer someone they could overlook or dismiss. The workshop occupied a separate building near the harbor's edge, where Leif could observe the progress on multiple ships while working on designs for future projects. The space was organized with the precision of someone who understood that efficiency and beauty were not opposing concepts. Tools hung in carefully arranged rows, their surfaces gleaming with regular maintenance. Drawing tables held plans and measurements, weighted down with stones and pieces of iron to prevent the sea breeze from disturbing the careful calculations. Leif looked up from a partially completed ship model as she entered, his expression registering surprise at her transformation. "Sigurd's work?" he asked. "Yes. She said I needed to represent your household properly." "She's right." He set down the small carving knife he had been using to shape the model's ribs. "You look different. More acceptable, you mean. More like yourself, I think. Or like who you were before." He paused, seeming to realize the implications of his words. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to suggest. It's all right. I know what you meant." Astrid moved closer to examine the ship model, a miniature longship complete with oars and steering mechanism. "Is this how you design them? Small versions first?" "Sometimes. It helps me work out proportions and test ideas before committing to full-scale construction." He picked up the model, turning it so she could see the delicate carving along the prow. "This one is for a merchant who wants speed and cargo capacity, but also the ability to defend himself if necessary. Another ship that could be used for raiding." Leif's hand stilled on the model. "Yes, though that's not its intended purpose. But, it's a possibility. I know many things are possible that I would prefer not to happen." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the weight of their shared knowledge hanging between them like smoke. Finally, Leif set the model aside and faced her directly. "I've been thinking about what work might suit you," he said. "Sigurd mentioned you seem intelligent and well-spoken. Can you read and write?" "Some. My mother taught me runes, and I learned a little Latin from the priest who visited our village." "Good. I need someone to help with correspondence and record-keeping. My current system is—" He gestured at a table covered with loose papers and clay tablets, somewhat chaotic. Astrid looked at the disorganized collection of notes, contracts, and measurements with growing understanding. Here was work that would put her in contact with every aspect of Leif's business, from the raw materials purchased to the final destinations of completed ships. Information that might help her understand the full scope of the violence she had enabled, and perhaps find ways to influence it. "I could organize this," she said carefully. "Create proper records, track orders and payments." Exactly what I was hoping. He pulled out a wooden stool for her to sit on. "We can start with these contracts from the past month. Most of them need to be copied in cleaner script and filed properly." As Astrid settled herself at the cluttered table and began sorting through the papers, she became aware of voices from the main shipyard workers calling instructions, the rhythm of hammers and saws, the creak of ropes and pulleys, the sounds of creation, but also the sounds of weapons being forged. Each contract she examined told a story. Earl Magnus ordering 3 warships for coastal defense. Jarl Thorvald commissioning a fast courier vessel for important communications. Merchant Knud requesting modifications to his trading ship to include additional protection for valuable cargo. The euphemisms were transparent to anyone who understood the realities of Norse society. Coastal defense meant raiding neighboring territories. Important communications meant carrying orders for military operations. Additional protection meant weapons and armor for crews who expected to fight for their profits. "You see it now, Leif," said quietly, watching her face as she read. The careful language that lets everyone pretend they're not ordering instruments of war. "Do you ever refuse commissions?" "Sometimes. When the request is too explicit, or when I know the customers." Reputation for unnecessary cruelty. He paused. "But not often enough, and not for the right reasons." "What would be the right reasons?" "I'm still figuring that out." As the morning progressed, Astrid found herself drawn into the rhythm of organizing Leif's chaotic records. The work was absorbing in a way that surprised her, requiring attention to detail and logical thinking that gave her mind something to focus on besides grief and anger. For the first time in months, she felt genuinely useful rather than merely desperate, but she was also acutely aware of the curious looks from workers who passed by the workshop, the way conversations stopped when she appeared, the subtle tensions her presence created in what had been a smoothly functioning community. She was the unknown quantity, the stranger whose motives remained unclear even to herself. Near midday, a commotion from the main yard drew their attention. Raised voices, the sound of tools being dropped, and underneath it all a tone of genuine alarm. Leif was on his feet immediately, Astrid close behind as they hurried toward the source of the disturbance. They found a crowd gathered around one of the workstations where a young apprentice lay motionless on the ground, his face pale and his breathing shallow. A heavy oak beam lay nearby, apparently fallen from the framework above. "What happened?" Leif demanded, kneeling beside the injured boy. "Rope gave way," Bjorn replied, his face grim. "Eric was underneath when the beam came down. Caught him across the chest and shoulder." Astrid found herself pushing forward without conscious thought, her body responding to a crisis with knowledge she had nearly forgotten she possessed. Her mother's training, the countless hours spent learning to identify injuries and mix remedies, came flooding back with startling clarity. "Let me see him," she said, dropping to her knees beside the apprentice. Several of the men looked at her with surprise, but Leif nodded his permission. Astrid's hands moved carefully over the boy's torso, checking for broken ribs, testing his responses, evaluating the color of his skin and the pattern of his breathing. "His ribs are cracked but not broken through," she announced after a few tense moments. "The shoulder is dislocated. He'll live, but he needs immediate attention." "What kind of attention?" Leif asked. "The shoulder needs to be reset before the muscles tighten too much. And I'll need herbs to help with the pain and prevent fever." She looked up at the ring of worried faces. Does anyone here know how to reset a dislocated joint? The silence that greeted her question told her everything she needed to know. These were skilled craftsmen who could shape wood and forge iron, but they knew little about healing human bodies broken by their dangerous work. "I do," she said quietly, "but I'll need help holding him steady and something for him to bite on when the pain hits." As Astrid worked to treat the injured apprentice, using skills she had thought lost forever, she became aware of a subtle shift in the atmosphere around her. The suspicious looks were replaced by attention, the whispered questions by respectful silence. For the first time since her arrival, she was not just Leif's charity case or mysterious houseguest Dodd. She was someone who could contribute something valuable, something that had nothing to do with the violence that had brought her here. The apprentice. Eric's recovery became a turning point that Astrid hadn't anticipated. Word of her healing skills spread through the shipyard like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, carrying with it a grudging respect that her clean clothes and organized ledgers hadn't been able to earn. Within days, workers were approaching her with minor injuries and ailments that they had previously endured in silence. Astrid found herself maintaining a small collection of healing supplies in one corner of Leif's workshop. Herbs she gathered from the areas around the port, salves she prepared according to her mother's recipes, and bandages torn from clean linen. The familiar work of mixing remedies and treating wounds awakened memories that were both painful and comforting, connecting her to a part of herself she had feared was lost forever. Her mother's recipe scroll had become her most treasured possession, more valuable than the shield boss in its way. The parchment was worn soft with age and handling, covered in her mother's careful script describing the preparation and use of dozens of traditional remedies. Willow bark for pain and fever, comfrey root for broken bones, yarrow for bleeding wounds. Knowledge passed down through generations of women who had served as healers in their communities. "Your mother was skilled," Leif observed one afternoon, watching her prepare a poultice for a carpenter who had cut his hand on a sharp chisel. "These recipes are more detailed than what most healers use." She learned from her grandmother, who learned from hers. Our family had always been the healers in our village. Astrid's voice carried a note of pride that surprised her. She had thought all such feelings had died with her family. "My mother said it was a sacred trust to ease suffering where we could. And now you're carrying on that tradition." "I suppose I am." She looked up from her work, meeting his eyes directly. "Though I never expected to be doing it in the workshop of the man whose ships destroyed my old life." The comment landed between them with the weight it was intended to carry, a reminder that her presence here was complicated by more than simple gratitude or economic necessity. Leif nodded acknowledgement, but didn't attempt to defend or explain his position. Something she had begun to appreciate about their interactions. He didn't waste words on empty justifications or false comfort. The routine they had developed over the past weeks was surprisingly functional. Mornings were spent organizing his correspondence and updating his records, work that had given her insight into the full scope of his business operations. Afternoons often involved treating injured workers or preparing healing supplies. Evenings found them sharing simple meals and careful conversation, two people learning to navigate around the sharp edges of their shared history. It was during one of these evening conversations that Astrid first glimpsed the man Leif might have been. "In a different world. I wasn't born to this," he said, gesturing at the workshop around them. "My father was a simple fisherman like yours. Built small boats for the coastal trade. Nothing like the warships I'm known for now. What changed? Ambition, I suppose. And a talent for understanding how wood and water work together." He stared into the flames of the small fire that warmed the workshop. "When I was young, I thought building bigger ships meant building a better life. I didn't think much about what those ships would be used for." "And when did you start thinking about it?" "Gradually. Each commission brought requests for modifications that made the intentions clearer. Reinforced rams for breaking through defensive barriers, hidden compartments for storing weapons, faster hulls for surprise attacks. His expression grew distant. By the time I understood what I had become, I was too successful to easily change course. Astrid studied his profile in the firelight, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult choices. But you could change course now if you wanted to. Could I? I have obligations to complete, workers who depend on the wages I pay, relationships with yawls and merchants that can't be severed without consequences. He looked at her directly. And even if I stopped building warships tomorrow, the ships I've already launched would continue carrying raiders to distant shores for decades to come. So you do nothing because you can't do everything? I tell myself that sometimes, but I think the truth is simpler. I'm afraid of what changing would cost me. The honesty of the admission surprised her. In the weeks since her arrival, she had seen Leif demonstrate courage in business negotiations and physical bravery in the dangerous work of shipbuilding. But this was a different kind of courage, the willingness to acknowledge his own fears and failings without excuse or deflection. What would you build instead? She asked. If you could start over, knowing what you know now. Trading vessels, exploration ships, ferries to carry people and goods safely across dangerous water. His voice grew animated as he spoke, revealing a passion she hadn't heard before. Ships designed to connect rather than conquer, to bring knowledge and prosperity, through exchange rather than violence. Why don't you? Because the market for such vessels is limited and the profits are smaller. Because the men who can afford to commission new ships are usually the same men who profit from warfare and raiding. He shrugged, but the gesture was heavy with resignation. Because changing the world is harder than succeeding within it as it exists. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the workshop door, unusual at this late hour, when most of the workers had long since returned to their homes. Leif opened it to reveal Bjorn, his face creased with concern. "Master, we have a problem," the carpenter said without preamble. "There's been an incident at Thorkel's shipyard. A fire." Astrid felt a chill of apprehension at the news. Thorkel. The Red was Leif's primary competitor in Stavanger, a builder known for accepting commissions that other craftsmen found too morally compromising. If something had happened to his operation, it could have significant implications for Leif's business. How bad? Leif asked. Bad enough. 3 ships damaged, 2 of them total losses. Thorkel's claiming it was sabotage, says someone's trying to corner the market by eliminating competition. The implications were clear. In a community where business relationships were personal and competition could turn deadly, accusations of sabotage were serious matters that could escalate quickly into blood feuds. Does he have evidence? Claims he found traces of lamp oil where it shouldn't have been, signs that the fire was deliberately set. Bjorn paused, clearly uncomfortable with what he had to say next. He's been asking questions about strangers in the area, people who might have grudges against shipbuilders. Astrid felt the weight of suspicious gazes turning in her direction, even though neither man had yet spoken her name. She was the obvious suspect, the mysterious woman who had appeared from nowhere, who had been watching Leif's shipyard for weeks before revealing herself, whose past connections to violence made her motives questionable. "I see," Leif said quietly. "And what do you think, Bjorn? Do you believe Thorkel's accusations?" The older man's loyalty was evident in his immediate response. "I think Thorkel's a fool who cuts corners on safety and blames others for his own carelessness. But I also think there are people in this community who won't be so quick to dismiss his claims. People who know about Astrid's presence here. People who know about her presence, yes. And people who might see an opportunity to cause trouble. For a competitor who's been taking too much of their business." The political dimensions of the situation were becoming clearer. Leif's success had inevitably created enemies among other shipbuilders. Merchants who felt displaced by his growing reputation, and jarls who resented his independence. Astrid's mysterious background made her a convenient scapegoat for anyone looking to damage Leif's standing in the community. "What do you recommend?" Leif asked. "Keep her close and visible. Make sure she's accounted for and has witnesses to her activities. And be prepared for questions from people who might not be satisfied with simple denials." After Bjorn left, Astrid and Leif sat in silence for several minutes, both understanding that the comfortable routine they had established was now under threat. The outside world, with its suspicions and political machinations, had intruded into the careful bubble of their developing relationship. "You don't believe I set the fire," Astrid said finally. "It wasn't quite a question. No, you've had opportunities to damage my operation if that had been your goal. And sabotage doesn't fit with what I've learned about your character. But others will believe it. Some will want to believe it, which amounts to the same thing in practical terms." Astrid considered the implications of being cast as the dangerous outsider, the vengeful survivor who had infiltrated Leif's household for destructive purposes. The irony was bitter. She who had lost everything to violence was now being suspected of perpetrating it. What happens if they can't prove I was responsible but continue to believe it anyway? Then we weather the suspicion and prove them wrong through your actions and character. Leif's voice carried a determination that surprised her. "I won't abandon you to their prejudices, Astrid. You've earned better than that, even if protecting me costs you business. Damages your reputation? Even then." The simple certainty of his response stirred something in her chest that she had thought permanently deadened by grief and anger. Not forgiveness. She wasn't ready for that. Might never be ready for that. But something like trust, or at least the possibility of trust, growing in the spaces between them like green shoots pushing through winter ground. "Why?" she asked. "Why risk what you've built for someone like me?" "Because someone like you is exactly the kind of person I should have been thinking about all along," he said. "Because your presence here has forced me to confront the real cost of my choices. And because, ... He paused, seeming to struggle with words. "Because I think you might be the only person who can help me find a way to build something better than what I've been building." Outside, the night wind was picking up, carrying with it the salt smell of the sea and the distant sound of voices from the taverns, where sailors and merchants gathered to drink and trade stories. Soon winter would come in earnest, bringing storms that would make sea travel treacherous and forcing the shipbuilding community to turn inward, to rely on the relationships and alliances that had been built during the more prosperous months. Astrid pulled her woolen shawl closer around her shoulders and considered the strange turns her life had taken since washing ashore in this foreign port. She had come here seeking death or answers, prepared for outcome. Instead, she had found something more complicated, a chance act, redemption for them both, purchased at the price of facing truths that neither had wanted to acknowledge. "If we're going to do this," she said slowly, "if we're going to try to change the kind of work you do, then we need to be honest about what it will cost. Your competitors will use any sign of weakness against you. Your customers will go elsewhere if they think you've grown soft. Your workers will leave if they think the business is failing. I know. And there's no guarantee that anyone will want the kind of ships you'd rather build. The world is what it is, not what we wish it could be. I know that too. Then why risk it?" Leif was quiet for a long moment, staring into the dying fire as if it might hold answers to questions he was only beginning to formulate. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of decision that seemed to settle something between them. "Because the alternative is continuing to be complicit in tragedies like yours. Because I'm tired of building beautiful things that bring ugly ends. And because I think you're right if I'm going to live with the consequences of my choices." I want those consequences to be ones I can bear. As they sat together in the workshop, surrounded by the tools and plans that represented both Leif's success and his moral burden, Astrid felt something shift in her understanding of their relationship. They were no longer simply victim and perpetrator, survivor and architect of destruction. They were two people who had been shaped by violence, seeking a way to reshape themselves and their world in response to that experience. The path ahead remained uncertain, fraught with dangers both personal and political. But for the first time since her family's death, Astrid felt the possibility of a future that might hold meaning beyond mere survival. Not redemption, perhaps, but something like purpose, the chance to transform their shared guilt into shared action, their mutual recognition of harm into a commitment to healing. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the workshop. Walls where tomorrow's plans waited to be realized. Outside, the night was deep and still, but somewhere in that darkness, the first hints of dawn were already gathering strength. The small leather pouch felt warm against Astrid's palm as she carefully sorted through its contents in the early morning light. The herbs inside carried the concentrated essence of her mother's knowledge: dried comfrey root for mending bones, powdered willow bark for easing pain, and precious chamomile flowers that her mother had always said could soothe both body and spirit. Each remedy represented not just healing potential, but a connection to the woman who had taught her that understanding plants was understanding life itself. The secret her mother had whispered during their last shared evening, unaware that raiders would come with the dawn, is listening to what the body needs before it knows how to ask. Plants speak the same language as flesh and bone, if you know how to hear them. Now, 3 weeks after the fire at Thorkel's shipyard, Astrid found herself relying on that inherited wisdom more than ever. The suspicious looks that had followed her through the port after the accusations of sabotage were gradually being replaced by requests for help, as word spread of her skill with injuries that had previously been dismissed as simply part of the shipbuilder's dangerous trade. Magnus, the ropemaker, had been the first to approach her after the initial whispers died down. His hands, twisted by years of handling rough hemp and tar, had developed a persistent ache that kept him awake at night and made fine work nearly impossible. The salve Astrid prepared from arnica and rendered fat had brought him relief that no amount of strong ale had been able to provide. Never seen anything like it, he told anyone who would listen, flexing fingers that moved with renewed grace. That woman's got healing in her very touch. Soon others followed. Bjorn's persistent cough from years of breathing sawdust yielded to a tea made from coltsfoot and honey. Young Eric, still recovering from his encounter with the fallen beam, found that Astrid's poultices drew the deep ache from his healing ribs better than any remedy the local wise woman could provide. Even some of the wives and children from the surrounding community began seeking her out, drawn by results that spoke louder than any lingering suspicions about her origins. The transformation in her status within the shipyard community was gradual, but undeniable. Where once conversations had stopped when she approached, now workers called out greetings and updates on their health. Where once she had eaten alone, now she often found herself invited to share meals with families who wanted to express their gratitude for her care. "You're becoming indispensable," Leif observed one afternoon, watching her prepare a batch of fever-reducing tea for the blacksmith's youngest son. "I'm not sure how we managed before you arrived." "You managed by accepting that certain kinds of suffering were simply the price of doing business," Astrid replied, not looking up from her careful measurement of willow bark. "People learned to live with pain because they didn't know it could be different. And now they do. Now they do." She sealed the prepared tea in a clay jar, labeling it with careful runes. "The question is whether that knowledge will survive once I'm gone." The comment was intended as practical observation, but Leif's reaction suggested he heard it as something else entirely. "Are you planning to leave?" I'm planning for the possibility. People like me don't often stay in one place long, especially when that place becomes complicated by politics and suspicion. People like you? Refugees, survivors, women with no family and uncertain histories. She finally looked up at him, noting the tension that had crept into his expression. People who disrupt the established order simply by existing. You found your place here. The workers respect you. The community needs your skills. Why would you consider leaving that behind? It was a fair question, one that Astrid had been asking herself with increasing frequency as the days grew shorter and her position in Leif's household became more secure. The practical arguments for staying were compelling. She had food, shelter, meaningful work, and growing acceptance from people who had initially viewed her with suspicion. Her healing abilities were not just appreciated, but actively sought, giving her a sense of purpose that had been absent from her life since her family's death. But beneath the surface, stability lay currents of uncertainty that she couldn't ignore. The fire at Thorkel's shipyard had been officially attributed to careless handling of lamp oil, but the accusations against her had revealed how quickly her position could become precarious. Her growing closeness to Leif was noticed and commented upon by others in ways that made her uncomfortable. Most significantly, she found herself caring about outcomes and people in ways that felt dangerous to someone who had lost everything once already. Because caring makes you vulnerable, she said finally. And I'm not sure I'm ready to be vulnerable again. Leif set down the ship model he had been working on and turned to face her directly. Over the weeks of their shared routine, she had learned to read the subtle expressions that crossed his face, the slight tightening around his eyes when he was working through a difficult problem, the way his shoulders relaxed when he reached a decision he could live with. You think caring about this place, about these people, means you're setting yourself up to lose them. I know it does. Everything can be taken away, Leif. I learned that lesson very thoroughly. So did I. The quiet certainty in his voice made her look at him more closely. In their evening conversations, he had shared some details of his past, his humble origins, his rise to prosperity, his growing awareness of the moral implications of his success. But there had been gaps in his story, periods he spoke of only. In general terms, experiences that had clearly shaped him, but which he kept carefully guarded. What did you lose? She asked. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he moved to the window that looked out over the harbor, his gaze distant as if he were seeing different ships, different times. I had a brother once, younger than me by 5 years, but always the braver of the two. While I was learning to shape wood and read the wind, Thorvald was training with sword and axe, dreaming of glory in foreign lands. Astrid felt her chest tighten at the past tense, recognizing the tone of someone preparing to share a fundamental wound. He convinced me to build him a ship. Nothing elaborate, a small longboat suitable for coastal raiding with a crew of maybe 20 men. I was just establishing my reputation then, and the commission seemed like a perfect opportunity to prove my skills while helping my brother achieve his ambitions. What happened? The ship was everything Thorvald had dreamed of fast, maneuverable, beautiful to behold. He gathered his crew of young men looking for adventure and glory, and they set off on what was supposed to be a simple raid against a Saxon settlement across the North Sea. Leif's hands gripped the window frame, his knuckles white with the force of old grief. They never came back. We found wreckage on the rocks 2 weeks later, enough to confirm that my perfect ship had been destroyed in a storm. No survivors, no bodies recovered. No way to know if they had died pursuing their dreams or fleeing from them. I'm sorry. At first, I told myself it was simply the price of living boldly, but Thorvald had died as he would have wanted pursuing adventure on the open sea. But as time passed and I began building larger ships for more ambitious raids, I started to understand that the beautiful vessel I had crafted for my brother had been his tomb. The parallel to her own story was obvious, both of them shaped by loss. both carrying guilt for the role they had played in enabling the violence that had claimed their families. But where her guilt was that of the survivor, his was that of the enabler, the creator of instruments that others used for destruction. Is that why you kept building warships? Because stopping wouldn't bring him back? Partly. But also because I discovered I was good at it, and good at ignoring the implications of my success. It's easier to focus on craftsmanship and profit than to think about the families destroyed by ships that bear your signature techniques. Until I arrived carrying proof of those consequences. Until you arrived and made it impossible to ignore them anymore. They stood in silence for several minutes, both lost in memories of siblings who would never grow older, never achieve the futures they had planned, never know that their deaths had bonded their survivors in ways that defied simple explanation. The workers have been asking when you'll start training apprentices, Leif said eventually, steering the conversation back to safer ground. Your healing knowledge is too valuable to remain with just one person. It was a practical suggestion that also carried deeper implications. Training others would mean committing to staying, to building something permanent rather than simply surviving from day to day. It would mean accepting that her knowledge could outlive her, continuing to help people even if circumstances forced her to leave. I've thought about it, she admitted. But teaching healing is different from teaching carpentry or metalwork. It requires understanding not just techniques, but the deeper connections between body and spirit, the ways that emotional wounds affect physical recovery. You could start with the basic remedies, the ones that don't require as much intuitive understanding. Perhaps. She looked at the various jars and pouches that now occupied a substantial portion of the workshop, each one representing hours of careful preparation and accumulated knowledge. I suppose it would be wasteful to let all this die with me. More than wasteful. It would be a betrayal of everyone who taught you, everyone who entrusted you with their knowledge. The comment struck deeper than Leif might have intended. Astrid had been thinking of her healing abilities as a burden she carried alone. But he was right that they represented a chain of teaching and learning that stretched back through generations. Her mother had received this knowledge from her grandmother, who had received it from hers, each generation adding to the store of understanding about how to ease suffering and promote healing. To let that chain break simply because she was afraid of forming new attachments would indeed be a betrayal of everyone who had contributed to its creation. I'll think about it, she said finally, but I want to be careful about who I teach. This knowledge can be dangerous in the wrong hands. Dangerous how? The same plants that heal can also harm, depending on dosage and preparation. Foxglove can regulate a failing heart or stop a healthy one. Nightshade can ease pain or cause death. A healer must understand not just how to use these tools, but when and why and for whom. The sobering reminder of the dual nature of her knowledge seemed to resonate with Leif, who understood better than most how creative skills could serve destructive ends. They were both practitioners of crafts that could benefit or harm, depending on the intentions and wisdom of the practitioner. Then we choose apprentices carefully, he said. People whose character we trust, who understand the responsibility that comes with such knowledge. We? If you'll let me help. I may not understand healing, but I do understand the process of selecting and training apprentices who can be trusted with dangerous skills. The offer was generous, but it also represented another step toward permanence. Another thread binding her to this place and these people. Astrid found herself torn between the practical appeal of the arrangement and her deep-seated fear of investing too heavily in anything that could be taken away. Before she could respond, the workshop door burst open to admit Eric, the young apprentice, whose recovery had first established Astrid's reputation as a healer. His face was flushed with excitement and exertion, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to deliver his message. Master Leif, Astrid, you need to come quickly. There's been an accident at the Thorson farm. Their youngest boy fell from the hay loft. and they think his leg might be broken. They're asking for Astrid specifically. The urgency in his voice dispelled any lingering philosophical discussions about the future. Astrid was already reaching for her leather satchel, checking to ensure it contained the supplies she might need for treating a serious fracture. "How far?" she asked, pulling her cloak around her shoulders. "Half a mile inland. I can guide you there." "Go," Leif said, his expression serious. "Take whatever you need from here. I'll have Bjorn prepare a stretcher in case the boy needs to be moved." As Astrid hurried from the workshop, her mind already shifting into the focused state she needed for treating serious injuries, she was struck by the naturalness of the response. No one had questioned her ability to help. No one had suggested sending for a more traditional healer. No one had hesitated to trust her with what might be a life-or-death situation. Somewhere in the weeks since her arrival, she had stopped being the suspicious stranger and become simply the person they turned to when healing was needed. The transformation felt both profound and fragile, a gift that could be withdrawn as easily as it had been granted. But as she followed Eric through the winding paths that led away from the harbor, her thoughts focused not on the politics of her position, but on the practical challenges ahead. A child was injured and in pain. Parents were frightened and desperate, and she possessed knowledge that might make the difference between recovery and permanent disability. The herbs in her pouch seemed to pulse with potential as she hurried toward whatever crisis awaited, carrying with her not just the accumulated wisdom of generations of healers, but the growing recognition that such knowledge was meaningless unless it was used in service of others. Whether she stayed or left, whether she trained apprentices or guarded her secrets, whether she found permanent peace or remained forever restless, none of that mattered as much as the immediate need to ease suffering where she could die. It was. She realized exactly what her mother would have done. The wooden bowl felt warm between Astrid's hands as she lifted it to her lips. The simple barley soup inside, carrying the mingled flavors of herbs from her own garden and vegetables from Leif's household stores. Across the small table in his private quarters, Leif ate from an identical bowl, the matching vessels a symbol of the quiet intimacy that had developed between them over the past month. It had begun as a practical arrangement. The injured Thorson boy's successful treatment had led to more requests for Astrid's healing services, often requiring her to work late into the evening, preparing remedies or traveling to distant farmsteads. Rather than having her eat alone after these long days, Leif had started inviting her to share simple meals in his quarters, where they could discuss the day's events without the curious eyes of the household staff. Now, as the first snows of winter dusted the shipyard and the harbor began to show signs of ice formation, these shared meals had become the anchor of both their days. The wooden bowl they both ate from, plain, well-made, worn smooth by years of use, had somehow become a tangible representation of their growing connection, a piece of domestic normalcy in lives that had been marked by loss and uncertainty. "The Eriksson family sent word this morning," Astrid said, setting down her bowl. "Their grandfather's breathing has improved since we started the lung-clearing treatment. They want to know if you consider reducing the interest on their grain debt as payment for the healing services." Leif smiled at the familiar pattern of barter that had developed around Astrid's work. In a community where coin was scarce and most transactions involved the exchange of goods and services, her healing abilities had become a valuable commodity that people were eager to trade for everything from foodstuffs to skilled labor. "What do you think?" he asked. "Is old Eriksson likely to recover fully? His lungs are clearing, but the damage from years of breathing forged smoke can't be completely healed. He'll have good days and bad days, but overall, yes, I think he'll see another spring. Then tell them we'll reduce the debt by half. The old man has grandchildren to think about." It was typical of Leif's approach to such requests, generous enough to be meaningful, but practical enough to ensure his business remained viable. Over the weeks, Astrid had watched him navigate dozens of similar situations, finding ways to accommodate the community's growing reliance on her services while maintaining the economic relationships that kept his shipyard functioning. "You realize what's happening, don't you?" she said, reaching for the piece of bread they were sharing. "People are starting to see us as a unit, a partnership that offers both practical and healing services. When they negotiate with you, they're calculating the value of access to my treatments. Does that bother you?" "I'm not sure. It's not what I expected when I agreed to stay here." She paused, considering her words carefully. "I came here seeking answers about my family's death, perhaps looking for some form of justice or revenge. I never thought I'd become part of a new kind of family." The word hung between them, heavier than either had intended. Family implied bonds that went beyond simple economic cooperation or mutual convenience. Connections that could survive the kind of losses they had both experienced. "Is that what we are?" Leif asked quietly. "A family?" "Of a sort, I think. Not the traditional kind, but something." She met his eyes across the table, noting the way the firelight caught the silver in his hair and softened the lines that worry had etched around his eyes. "We eat from the same bowl. We work toward the same goals. We protect each other's interests. If not family, then what would you call it? Partnership, perhaps, or alliance. Those are business terms. What we have feels more personal than that." "More personal how?" The question was gentle but direct, asking her to articulate feelings that she had been carefully avoiding examining too closely. Over the weeks of shared meals and quiet conversations, of working together to help injured workers and planning modifications to the shipyard operations, something had shifted between them that went beyond their original arrangement. "I care what happens to you," she said finally. "Not just because your success affects my security, but because I've come to value who you are as a person. I worry when you stay late working on difficult designs. I feel proud when customers praise the quality of your ships. I get angry when competitors try to undermine your reputation. And I care what happens to you in the same way," he replied. "When you're called away to treat serious injuries, I find myself unable to concentrate on other work until I know you've returned safely. When people speak well of your healing abilities, I feel a satisfaction that has nothing to do with how your reputation reflects on my household. So what does that make us? Complicated." The admission drew a soft laugh from both of them, acknowledging the impossibility of defining their relationship in conventional terms. They were bound together by tragedy and guilt, by mutual respect and growing affection, by shared work and the gradual recognition that they had somehow become essential to each other's daily existence. "The workers have been asking questions," Astrid said, steering the conversation toward more practical concerns. "Subtle ones, but persistent. They want to know if our arrangement is permanent, if they should plan on having a healer available indefinitely. What do you tell them?" "That I stay as long as I'm useful and welcome." But they're asking because they're making plans that depend on the answer. Families are deciding whether to have more children, knowing that a skilled healer would be available for difficult births. Young men are considering more dangerous work, counting on treatment for injuries that might otherwise be crippling. The responsibility implied in such dependencies was sobering. Astrid's presence had begun to change the community's calculations about risk and safety, their expectations about what level of suffering was acceptable and what could be prevented or treated. "Are you comfortable with that level of expectation?" Leif asked. "I don't know. It's flattering to be so valued, but also frightening. What happens if I get sick or injured, or simply make a mistake that costs someone their life? What happens if circumstances force me to leave, and people have made irreversible decisions based on the assumption that I'd always be here? The same things that happen when any valuable member of a community is lost. People adapt, find other solutions, accept higher levels of risk." He paused. "But in the meantime, lives are saved and suffering is reduced. Isn't that worth something, even if it can't be guaranteed permanently?" It was a philosophy that Astrid found both compelling and troubling. The logical part of her mind agreed that temporary good was still good, that helping people while she could was better than not helping at all. But the part of her that had survived devastating loss wanted certainties and guarantees that simply didn't exist. "Sometimes I think my mother would be proud of what I'm doing here," she said, absently, tracing patterns on the wooden table surface. "Other times I think she'd be worried that I'm setting myself up for another kind of heartbreak. What do you think she'd say about us? About this arrangement we've created?" The question was one that Astrid had been avoiding, partly because it required her to imagine her mother's reaction to the complex relationship she had developed with the man whose ships had enabled her family's destruction. Her mother had been pragmatic about survival, but uncompromising about justice, forgiving toward human weakness but intolerant of willful cruelty. "I think she'd say that healing and building can both serve life or death, depending on the intentions behind them," Astrid said slowly. "And that the measure of a person isn't the harm they've caused in the past, but whether they're working to cause less harm in the future. Do you believe that? I'm trying to. Some days it's easier than others." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door, followed by Sigrid's voice announcing that a messenger had arrived with urgent business for Leif. The interruption felt jarring after the intimate quality of their discussion, a reminder that the outside world continued to make demands on their time and attention. The messenger proved to be a young man bearing a sealed letter from Earl Magnus, one of Leif's most important customers and a powerful political figure in the region. The wax seal bore the Earl's personal mark, suggesting that the message concerned more than routine. Business Matters. Leif read the letter twice before setting it aside with an expression that mixed concern with resignation. "Earl Magnus wants to commission a new class of warship, larger than anything I've built before, specifically designed for extended raiding campaigns." "That sounds like good business," Astrid said carefully, though something in Leif's manner suggested otherwise. "It would be if the commission were simply about building ships. But Magnus is also requesting detailed consultation on raid planning, suggestions for target selection, and ongoing support for what he's calling strategic maritime operations." The implications became clear as Astrid processed the request. Earl Magnus wasn't just asking Leif to build ships. He was asking him to become an active participant in planning the violence those ships would enable, to move from passive enabler to active architect of destruction. "What will you tell him?" "I don't know yet. Refusing would mean losing my most valuable customer and probably earning his active hostility. But accepting would mean crossing a line I'm not sure I can cross, becoming directly complicit in ways that building ships alone never quite was. And there's no middle ground?" "There might be, but finding it would require careful negotiation and the risk that Magnus would interpret any hesitation as disloyalty." Astrid studied Leif's face as he spoke, noting the tension around his eyes and the way his hands moved restlessly, betraying his internal conflict. This was the test she had been half expecting since their first conversation about changing the direction of his work. The moment when idealistic intentions would collide with practical pressures and economic necessities. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to refuse. I want to tell Magnus that I'm a shipbuilder, not a war planner, and that he can take his business elsewhere if he needs more than craftsmanship." He paused, looking directly at her. "But I also want to be realistic about the consequences of such a decision, which would be loss of income, certainly, possible retaliation from Magnus and his allies, difficulty finding alternative customers who don't have similar expectations about my involvement in their activities." He was quiet for a moment. "And potential danger for everyone associated with my household, including you." The last point carried particular weight, since Astrid's position in the community remained somewhat precarious despite her growing acceptance. If Leif's business failed, or if he made powerful enemies, she could easily find herself once again, without protection or resources, possibly blamed for influencing his decisions in ways that damaged local interests. You're asking what I think you should do. I'm asking what you think we should do. Your future is tied to mine now, whether we planned it that way or not. The recognition of their mutual dependence was both comforting and frightening. Comforting because it meant she was no longer alone in making decisions that would shape her survival. Frightening because it meant that caring about Leif's choices was no longer optional. His success or failure would directly impact our own safety and security. If you refuse Magnus directly, could you offer him an alternative? She asked. Something that meets his needs without requiring you to cross lines you're not comfortable crossing? What kind of alternative? I don't know enough about ship design to suggest specifics. But you're known for innovation, for finding creative solutions to technical problems. Maybe there's a way to give him superior vessels without becoming his strategic advisor. Leif considered this, his expression thoughtful. It's possible. Magnus wants ships that can carry larger crews over longer distances, with better speed and maneuverability than conventional longships. Those are technical challenges I could address without involving myself in how the resulting vessels are used. And if he presses for more involvement, then I explain that my expertise is in construction, not warfare, and that he'd be better served consulting with experienced raid leaders for tactical advice. It seemed like a reasonable compromise, allowing Leif to maintain his primary business relationship while avoiding deeper complicity in violent activities. But Astrid could see the uncertainty in his expression, the recognition that such diplomatic solutions might not satisfy a customer accustomed to having his requests met without negotiation. There's another consideration, she said quietly. If you do build these ships for Magnus, if they're used for the kind of extended raiding campaigns he's planning, there will be more villages like mine, more families destroyed, more survivors washing up on foreign shores with nothing but grief and anger. I know. And some of those survivors might end up here, in this community, looking for the people responsible for their loss. I've thought about that too. They sat in silence for several minutes, both understanding that whatever decision Leif made would have consequences that extended far beyond their personal relationship. The warm intimacy of their shared meal seemed fragile now, threatened by the larger forces that shaped their world and limited their choices. What would you do? Leif asked finally, if you were in my position. It was a question that required Astrid to imagine herself as the person making choices that could enable violence, rather than simply surviving its consequences. The perspective shift was difficult, forcing her to consider the complex web of pressures and obligations that shaped decision-making for someone in Leif's position. I think I would try to find a way to say yes to the technical challenges and no to the strategic involvement, she said slowly. I would build the best ships I could, but I would also look for ways to build other kinds of vessels for other kinds of customers. And I would use whatever influence I had to encourage less destructive approaches to achieving the same goals. And if that wasn't enough, if the pressures continued to push toward greater involvement in violence, then I suppose I'd have to decide what I could live with and what I was willing to risk in order to live with myself. As they prepared for sleep that night, each returning to their separate quarters, but carrying the weight of shared concerns, Astrid found herself thinking about the wooden bowl they had eaten from. Such a simple object, yet it had become a symbol of the life they had built together, practical, comfortable, marked by use and time, valuable not for its beauty, but for its utility and the rituals it enabled. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever pressures would test their growing partnership, that bowl would remain a reminder that even in a world shaped by violence and uncertainty, it was possible to create small spaces of peace and connection, moments of shared sustenance that nourished both body and spirit. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the shipyard in pristine white that temporarily concealed the instruments of war taking shape beneath its covering. But inside, warmed by carefully tended fires and the presence of someone who had come to matter more than either had expected, Astrid felt something that might have been contentment, fragile as new ice, but real as the bowl they shared. The parchment felt heavy in Astrid's hands, heavier than its physical weight could account for, as if the ink itself carried the substance of betrayal. She had come to Leif's workshop early, hoping to complete the inventory of healing supplies before the day's customers arrived, only to find the document lying open on his desk, where the morning light streaming through the window made its contents. Impossible to ignore. It was a marriage contract, elaborately written in the formal script used for legal documents, sealed with red wax that bore the impression of a wolf's head, the same symbol that had adorned her brother's shield, the mark of the Iron Wolf clan that had destroyed her family. Her hands trembled as she read the carefully crafted language that bound Leif Erikson, master shipbuilder of Stavanger, to Ingrid Thorvaldstader, daughter of Jarl Thorvald Ironwolf, in a union designed to cement political and economic alliances between their families. The betrothal had been arranged 3 years earlier, according to the document's dates, long before Astrid had washed ashore and entered Leif's life. The marriage was scheduled to take place with the coming of spring, when travel would be easier and the great families could gather to witness the alliance that would unite the region's most skilled shipbuilder with its most powerful clan leader. Astrid's stomach churned as she absorbed the implications. The man who had offered her shelter and work, who had shared quiet meals and gentle conversations, who had seemed genuinely committed to finding a less violent path forward, was pledged to marry the daughter of the chieftain who had ordered her village's destruction. The alliance would make him not just complicit in past violence, but formally allied with its primary architect. You weren't supposed to see that yet. Leif's voice from the doorway made her jump, the parchment rustling in her suddenly unsteady hands. He stood silhouetted against the morning light, his expression unreadable, apparently having arrived to find her studying the document that revealed the most significant deception of their relationship. Yet, she repeated, her voice sounding strange and distant to her own ears. Were you planning to tell me eventually, or was I supposed to discover it when the wedding ships arrived? I was trying to find the right way to explain the situation. He stepped into the workshop, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. The arrangement was made years ago, before I understood what kind of man Thorvald really was, before I knew about the specific raids he had ordered. Before you knew about me, you mean? Before you had to face the human cost of your business relationships? Yes. The simple honesty of his answer was somehow more devastating than elaborate justifications would have been. He wasn't denying the timeline or the circumstances, merely acknowledging that his perspective had changed in ways that made his previous commitments untenable. So you've known all along, Astrid said, still staring at the contract, as if its words might somehow rearrange themselves into something less damning. Every conversation we've had about changing the direction of your work, every shared meal, every moment of growing closeness, you've known that come spring, you would be married to the daughter of the man who killed my family. I've known about the betrothal, yes, but I haven't known what I was going to do about it. And what are you going to do about it? Leif moved to the window, looking out at the shipyard where his workers were beginning their daily tasks, apparently seeking time to formulate his response. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of decision that suggested he had been wrestling with this question for weeks. I'm going to refuse the marriage. You're going to refuse Jarl Thorvald, one of the most powerful men in the region? Yes. Even though it will destroy your business relationships, make you enemies, possibly put your life in danger? Even though all of that. Astrid set the contract down carefully, her hands still trembling with the effort of maintaining control over her emotions. The practical part of her mind recognized that Leif's willingness to sacrifice his arranged marriage represented a profound commitment to the values they had been discussing. But the wounded part of her heart felt only the betrayal of discovering that their entire relationship had been built on a foundation of concealed obligations that made genuine partnership impossible. "Why?" she asked. "Why give up everything you've worked for?" "Because marrying Thorvald's daughter would make me complicit in his future violence in ways that building ships never quite did. Because it would mean aligning myself formally with the kind of destruction that brought you to my door." He turned from the window to face her directly. "And because I can't imagine pledging my life to someone else when you're the person I think about when I wake up and the last person I want to see before sleep." The confession hung between them like a bridge that neither was sure they should cross. In other circumstances, it might have been the foundation for joy, the acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing steadily despite the complicated origins of their relationship. But in the context of the hidden betrothal and its implications, it felt more like another burden, another impossible choice in a life that had already demanded too many of them. "You can't refuse this marriage because of me," Astrid said quietly. "I won't be responsible for destroying your future." "You're not destroying anything. You're giving me a reason to choose a different future than the one I was drifting toward without thinking. A future that could get you killed. Thorvald doesn't seem like the kind of man who accepts refusal gracefully. Probably not. But living in fear of Thorvald's reaction means living under his control, whether I marry his daughter or not." Astrid stood and moved away from the desk, needing physical distance from the contract and its implications. The workshop that had become a sanctuary for their growing partnership now felt contaminated by the knowledge of what Leif had been hiding. What obligations had shaped his choices, even as he seemed to be making them freely. "How long have you been planning to refuse?" she asked. "I've been considering it for weeks, ever since Earl Magnus's request made it clear that my business relationships were pushing me toward deeper involvement in violence. But I didn't make the final decision until last night, after our conversation about what we could live with. So this is a recent choice, not something you've been planning all along. The choice to refuse is recent. The desire to refuse, that's been growing since the day you found your brother's shield in my storage building." The admission revealed the depth of the moral conflict Leif had been experiencing, the gradual recognition that his arranged marriage represented not just personal obligation, but complicity in a system of violence that had already cost too much. But it also highlighted how much their relationship had been shaped by circumstances neither had fully understood. "What about Ingrid?" Astrid asked. "Thorvald's daughter. What happens to her when you refuse the marriage?" "I don't know. The contract includes provisions for substantial compensation if the betrothal is broken, so her family won't suffer financially. But politically," he shrugged, acknowledging the complexity of the situation, "she need to find another advantageous marriage. And this refusal might make that more difficult." "Have you met her?" "Twice. She's young, maybe 19, and seems intelligent enough. I think she understands that the marriage is political rather than romantic, but I don't know how she feels about the arrangement personally." Astrid tried to imagine the young woman who would be affected by Leif's decision, someone whose future had been planned around a marriage that would now not take place. In a world where women's security depended largely on their family connections and marriage, alliances, having a betrothal canceled, could have serious consequences. She might be relieved, Astrid said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. Not everyone wants to be married for political convenience. Or she might be devastated, especially if she had begun to build her expectations around the life we would have shared. The consideration he showed for a woman he barely knew, someone whose claim on his future had been arranged by others, spoke to the fundamental decency that had made their own relationship possible. even as he prepared to break promises he had never wanted to make. He was concerned about the collateral damage his choices might cause. "There's something else you need to know," Leif said, his voice carrying a new note of urgency. "About why this contract was on my desk this morning instead of stored with my other legal documents." "What do you mean?" A messenger arrived before dawn with a letter from Thorvald. "He's accelerating the timeline. Instead of waiting for spring, he wants the marriage to take place next month, as soon as travel conditions permit." The news hit Astrid like a physical blow. A spring wedding had seemed distant, something they could plan around and prepare for. A wedding next month meant immediate crisis. Decisions that couldn't be delayed or reconsidered. Why the hurry? Political pressures, according to his letter. He's planning a major campaign for the coming year and wants the alliance formalized before he commits to it. He's also concerned about rumors that I might be having second thoughts about the arrangement. What? Rumors? Apparently, word has spread about my recent reluctance to take on certain kinds of commissions, my questions about the purposes of ships I'm asked to build. Some people have interpreted this as weakness or disloyalty, and Thorvald wants to ensure my commitment before investing more trust in our relationship. The web of political implications was becoming clearer. Leif's growing moral consciousness had been noticed and interpreted as a potential threat to the alliances that depended on his skills. The accelerated marriage timeline was Thorvald's way of forcing a public commitment that would make any future doubts or defections more costly. So if you refuse now, it won't just be breaking a betrothal, it will be a public repudiation of Thorvald's authority, a statement that you're choosing opposition over alliance. Exactly. Which means the consequences will be more severe than they would have been for a quiet refusal months from now. Astrid felt the walls of choice closing in around them both. The careful balance they had achieved her growing security. In his household, his gradual movement toward less destructive work, their developing partnership, all of it, was threatened by decisions that had been made years earlier and consequences that could no longer be avoided. "What if you went through with the marriage?" she asked, hating herself for suggesting it but needing to understand all their options. "What if you married Ingrid but found ways to limit your involvement in Thorvald's activities?" "You mean compromise with the system rather than confronting it." "I mean survive within the system while working to change it from inside." Leif considered this, his expression troubled. "It might be possible, for a while. I could fulfill my obligations as Thorvald's son-in-law while trying to influence him toward less destructive approaches. I could use my position to protect people who might otherwise be harmed. But it would mean living a lie, pretending loyalty I don't feel, building a marriage on deception. And it would mean accepting that some level of complicity is inevitable, that there's no way to remain pure while engaging with an impure world. Maybe purity is a luxury that people like us can't afford. Maybe the best we can do is try to cause less harm while we work toward causing no harm. Is that what you really believe?" Astrid was quiet for a long moment, recognizing that her suggestion came from fear rather than conviction. Fear of losing the security and partnership she had found. Fear of facing an uncertain future without the anchor of life's protection and affection. "I believe that I don't want to be responsible for your destruction," she said finally. "I believe that sacrificing everything for principles is easier to contemplate than to actually do. And I believe that I care too much about what happens to you to give you objective advice about what choices you should make." "Then don't give me objective advice. Tell me what you want, as someone whose future is tied to mine. I want you too. Be safe. I want us to be able to continue building something together, even if it's not perfect, even if it requires compromises I wish we didn't have to make." She paused, struggling with the complexity of her feelings. "But I also want to be able to respect the man I'm building that future with. And I don't know if I could respect someone who married the daughter of my family's killer, even if he did. It for practical reasons. So you want me to refuse the marriage, despite the risks. I want you to make the choice you can live with, whatever that is. But I also want you to understand that if you go through with this wedding, our relationship will have to change. I can't continue to work closely with Thorvald's son-in-law. Can't pretend that such a connection doesn't matter. The ultimatum was gentler than it might have been, but it was still an ultimatum. Astrid recognized the unfairness of forcing Leif to choose between political survival and personal relationship, but she also knew that some compromises were beyond her ability to accept. "I understand," he said quietly, "and I think I've known all along that this choice would eventually have to be made. I was just hoping to postpone it until I had found a way to make it less costly. There might not be a way to make it less costly. Sometimes the price of doing the right thing is simply higher than we want to pay. Is that another lesson from your mother?" "That's a lesson from everything that's happened since she died." They stood in silence for several minutes, both understanding that whatever decision Leif made would reshape both their lives in ways they couldn't fully predict. The contract lay between them on the desk like an accusation, its formal language a reminder of the wider world that constrained their choices and demanded compromises that neither wanted to make. Outside, the sounds of the shipyard continued hammers and saws voices calling instructions. The everyday work of creating vessels that would carry men across dangerous waters toward unknown destinies. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that they were having this conversation surrounded by the tools and evidence of the work that had brought them together and now threatened to tear them apart. "I need time to think," Leif said finally. "To consider all the implications and find the best way forward." "How much time do you have?" "Thorvald expects a response within the week. If I'm going to refuse, I need to do it soon enough that he can make alternative arrangements. And if you're going to accept, then I need to begin preparing for a wedding that will change everything about the life I've been building." As Astrid left the workshop, the marriage contract still lying on Leif's desk like a challenge waiting to be answered, she found herself thinking about the choices that had led them to this moment. Her decision to confront him about her brother's shield, his decision to offer her shelter and work, their gradual movement toward partnership and something that might have been love if circumstances had been different. All of it had been built on the foundation of concealed truths and obligations neither had fully understood. Now those foundations were cracking, forcing them to decide whether what they had built together was strong enough to survive the revelation of its flawed beginnings, or whether honesty would prove to be the thing that destroyed them both. The winter air bit at her face as she walked back toward the main house, but Astrid barely noticed the cold. Her mind was occupied with calculations she wished she didn't have to make, the relative costs of safety and integrity, the price of loyalty versus the price of principle, the question of whether love could survive the kind of choices that their world demanded. Behind her, she could see Leif still standing at the window of his workshop, the marriage contract a pale rectangle on the desk beside him, the future balanced on the edge of a decision that would determine not just their personal happiness but their very survival in a world that offered few second chances for those who chose principle over pragmatism. The Thor's hammer pendant felt warm against Astrid's palm as Leif pressed it into her hands, the ancient silver catching the firelight from the workshop hearth. The pendant had belonged to his father and his father's father before him, passed down through generations of men who had lived by the sea and understood its moods. Now Leif was giving it to her, the weight of family history and personal commitment, settling between them like an unspoken vow. "I sent the letter this morning," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving her face as she examined the intricate knotwork carved into the pendant's surface. "Thorvald knows that the betrothal is ended." 3 days had passed since their confrontation over the marriage contract. 3 days during which Leif had wrestled with the implications of his choice, while Astrid tried to prepare herself for whatever consequences would follow. The pendant represented the finality of his decision, a tangible symbol that he was choosing them over the safety of political alliance and conventional wisdom. "What did you tell him?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the details of how one refused the most powerful jarl in the region. "The truth, as much as I dared. That my conscience no longer allows me to enter into marriages arranged for political convenience. That I've come to understand the true cost of the alliances I've been part of, and I can't in good faith bind myself to someone whose family's actions I fundamentally oppose." "You told Thorvald that you oppose his actions?" "I told him that our values have proven incompatible, and that any marriage between our families would serve neither party well." Leif's mouth curved in a grim smile. "I tried to be diplomatic, but diplomacy has its limits when you're essentially calling someone a butcher to his face." Astrid closed her fingers around the pendant, feeling its edges press into her skin. The metal was old and worn smooth by generations of handling, but the Thor's hammer symbol remained clear, a representation of protection, strength, and the kind of power that defended rather than destroyed. "How long do we have before he responds?" "A few days, maybe a week if we're fortunate. Messengers take time to travel in winter conditions, and Thorvald will want to consider his options carefully before acting." "His options for retaliation?" "You mean, among other things, yes." The understatement was typical of Leif's manner, but Astrid had learned to read the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands moved restlessly when he was worried about something he couldn't control. Thorvald's potential responses ranged from economic pressure to physical violence, and all of them pose serious threats to the life they have been building together. "Bjorn thinks we should prepare for siege," she said, recounting the conversation she'd overheard between the senior carpenter and several of the other workers. "Board up the windows, stock food and water, maybe even arrange for additional guards. Bjorn has good instincts about these things. He's survived more political conflicts than most men his age." Leif moved to the workshop window, looking out at the shipyard, where work continued despite the uncertainty hanging over their future. "But I'm not sure hiding behind walls is the answer. If Thorvald wants to destroy us, he has resources that simple defenses won't stop." "Then what do you suggest?" "I suggest we continue working, continue building, continue helping the people who depend on us. If we're going to face consequences for the choice I've made, let's face them while doing something worthwhile rather than cowering in fear." It was an admirable philosophy, but Astrid wasn't sure it was a practical one. The workers in the shipyard had families to protect, obligations that extended beyond their loyalty to Leif's household. If staying meant exposing them to danger from Thorvald's retaliation, how long could they be expected to remain? "Some of the men have been asking questions," she said carefully, "about their futures here, about whether their families will be safe if they continue working for you." "And what have you told them?" "That I don't know any more than they do about what's coming, but that running from Thorvald won't necessarily protect them if he's determined to make an example of anyone associated with your decision." It was harsh logic, but accurate. In a community where political alliances shaped economic opportunities and personal safety, neutrality was often impossible. The workers who fled Leif's employ might find themselves blacklisted from other positions. If Thorvald chose to punish anyone who had supported his rival, staying carried risks, but leaving carried different risks that might prove equally dangerous. "I've been thinking about alternatives," Leif said, turning back from the window. "Ways to reduce the risks for everyone involved while still maintaining our principles." "What kind of alternatives?" "Relocation, possibly. There are other ports, other communities, where a skilled shipbuilder could establish operations. Places where Thorvald's influence is weaker, where we might be able to start fresh." The suggestion surprised her. During all their conversations about changing the direction of his work, Leif had never mentioned the possibility of simply leaving Stavanger and everything he had built there. The shipyard represented decades of careful development, relationships with suppliers and customers that couldn't be easily replicated elsewhere. You would give up everything here. Your reputation, your established business, the life you've spent years creating? I would give up everything here to protect the people I care about and to build something that aligns with the values we've been discussing. The question is whether you would be willing to make that kind of sacrifice for an uncertain future. Astrid felt her breath catch as she understood what he was asking. Not just whether she would support his decision to refuse the marriage, but whether she would literally flee with him to unknown destinations, abandoning the security and acceptance she had fought so hard to achieve in this community. Where would we go? South, possibly. There are Saxon kingdoms that value skilled craftsmen and don't ask too many questions about their backgrounds. Or east, to the trading centers along the great rivers where Norse and Slavic cultures meet. Places where your healing abilities would be as valued as my shipbuilding skills. And you think we could simply disappear? But Thorvald would let us go quietly. I think Thorvald's primary concern is his daughter's marriage prospects and his own political standing. If we remove ourselves from his territory, we become less important than the problems that remain in his immediate vicinity. It was possible, though not certain. Powerful men like Thorvald were often willing to let enemies escape rather than expending resources on pursuit, especially if those enemies posed no immediate threat to their interests. But they were also capable of holding grudges for years, of striking when their targets felt most secure. What about the workers? The people here who depend on the shipyard for their livelihoods? That's the hardest part, Leif admitted. I can offer to take some of them with us, the ones whose skills would transfer easily to new locations. For the others, ... He shrugged, acknowledging the limits of his ability to protect everyone. I can provide severance payments, recommendations to other employers, whatever help I can manage. But I can't guarantee their futures any more than I can guarantee our own. The moral complexity of the situation was staggering. Staying meant risking everyone's safety for the sake of maintaining what they had built. Leaving meant abandoning some people to protect others, sacrificing the community they had become part of for the sake of personal survival. There's another option, Astrid said slowly, an idea taking shape as she spoke. Something that might allow us to stay while reducing the risks. What do you have in mind? Public atonement. A formal acknowledgement of the harm that ships from this yard have caused, combined with a commitment to different kinds of work going forward. Leif's eyebrows rose at the suggestion. You're talking about something that would damage my reputation with customers who profit from warfare. I'm talking about something that might earn us protection from people who suffer from warfare. If we make it clear that we're actively working against the kind of violence that Thorvald represents, we might gain allies who would help defend us against his retaliation. You think the victims of raiding would see us as allies rather than enemies? I think some of them might, especially if we can demonstrate genuine change through our actions rather than just our words. It was a risky strategy, one that would require them to openly oppose not just Thorvald, but the entire system of violence and exploitation that sustained much of the Norse economy. But it also offered the possibility of building different kinds of relationships, alliances based on shared values rather than mutual benefit from others' suffering. What would such atonement look like in practical terms? I'm not sure yet. Maybe refusing to build warships entirely, focusing only on trading vessels and fishing boats. Maybe using our resources to help other survivors, other people displaced by the violence we've been part of. Maybe finding ways to actively oppose raids rather than simply declining to support them. Active opposition could be even more dangerous than simple refusal. Everything is dangerous now. The question is whether we want to face that danger while hiding from our past or while working to create a different future. They were interrupted by urgent knocking at the workshop door, followed by Bjorn's voice calling for immediate attention. The tone carried an urgency that made both Astrid and Leif tense. Recognizing the sound of crisis that couldn't be postponed, Bjorn entered with his face flushed from exertion and worry, clearly having run from whatever location had generated his concern. "Master, we have visitors." "Armed visitors, flying Thorvald's banner. How many?" Leif asked, his voice steady despite the implications. "A dozen mounted men, maybe more. They're setting up what looks like a formal encampment on the hill overlooking the harbor. Not an immediate attack, but a clear message about intentions." The speed of Thorvald's response surprised both of them. Either he had anticipated Leif's refusal and prepared his reaction in advance, or he considered the slight serious enough to warrant immediate action despite winter travel conditions. "Any sign of Thorvald himself?" "No, but the leader is someone I recognize, Harald Grimson, Thorvald's war chief. Not a man known for diplomatic solutions." The identification of Harald as the expedition's leader suggested that Thorvald was treating this as a military matter rather than a personal one. Harald's reputation for violence was well established throughout the region, making him an effective tool for intimidation and enforcement. "What do you recommend?" Leif asked. "Immediate preparations. For defense and probably negotiation." Harald didn't bring enough men for a full assault on the shipyard, but he brought enough to make life very difficult for everyone associated with your operations. So this is about pressure rather than destruction, for now. But pressure can escalate quickly if the initial message doesn't produce the desired response. Astrid felt the pendant growing warm in her clenched fist as she processed the reality of their situation. The abstract threat of Thorvald's retaliation had become concrete, immediate, unavoidable. Whatever choices they made in the next few hours would determine not just their own futures, but the fates of everyone who worked in the shipyard and their families. "There's something else," Bjorn continued, his expression growing more troubled. "Harald sent a formal message requesting a meeting. He wants to discuss terms for resolving the conflict between you and Jarl Thorvald." "Terms for my submission? You mean, probably, but also possibly terms for your survival if you're willing to negotiate." "And if I'm not willing to negotiate?" "Then I suspect we'll discover what a dozen armed men can accomplish against a shipyard full of carpenters and metalworkers." The stock assessment crystallized their situation. They were facing a choice between capitulation and confrontation, between accepting whatever terms Thorvald offered through his war chief or preparing for a conflict they were poorly equipped to win. "When does Harald want this meeting?" Leif asked. "Tomorrow at midday in the main hall. Public enough to prevent immediate violence, private enough for frank discussion. Then we have tonight to decide what terms we're willing to accept and what terms we're prepared to die rather than agree to." As Bjorn left to organize the shipyard's defenses and spread word of the crisis to the workers' families, Astrid and Leif stood facing each other in the workshop that had become the center of their shared life. The pendant in her hand seemed to pulse with the weight of the decision ahead, a tangible reminder that some choices, once made, couldn't be unmade. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Leif said quietly, "I want you to know that refusing Thorvald's daughter was the right choice. Not just for us, but for the person I want to be. Even if it gets us both killed, even then. Some things are worth dying for, and the chance to live without compromising your fundamental beliefs is one of them." Astrid looked at the pendant, its Thor's hammer symbol catching the last light of the dying fire. Protection and strength, the power to defend what mattered most. Perhaps that was what they would need tomorrow, not the wisdom to find a perfect solution, but the courage to defend their choices, even when those choices led to dangerous places. Then we face Harald together, she said, slipping the pendant's chain over her head. And we see whether our principles are strong enough to protect us from the consequences of upholding them. Outside, the winter wind was picking up, carrying with it the sound of armed men making camp and the knowledge that everything they had built together would soon be tested by forces beyond their control. But inside the workshop, warmed by the dying fire and the presence of someone worth making difficult choices for, they found the strength to face whatever dawn might bring. The battle-worn axe felt strange in Leif's hands as he lifted it from the wooden chest where it had rested for nearly 3 years. The weapon had been his constant companion during the early years of his career, when shipbuilders were expected to defend their own work and the line between craftsman and warrior was often thin. Now its familiar weight seemed to carry the accumulated memory of choices he had hoped never to make again. Harold Grimson stood in the center of the shipyard's main courtyard, his presence commanding attention from the gathered workers and their families. The war chief was a man built for intimidation, tall, broad-shouldered, with scars that spoke of countless battles and eyes that suggested he had enjoyed most of them. His mail shirt gleamed in the midday sun, and the sword at his side bore the distinctive wolf's head pommel that marked him as one of Thorvald's inner circle. "Leif Erikson," Harold called out, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard. Jarl Thorvald sends his greetings and his disappointment. He had hoped that cooler heads would prevail before matters reached this unfortunate point. "Tell Jarl Thorvald that I appreciate his concern," Leif replied, stepping forward with the axe held casually at his side. "But my decision regarding the marriage contract is final. I'm prepared to pay whatever compensation the agreement requires, but I will not be bound to an alliance that violates my conscience." Conscience. Harold repeated the word as if it were a foreign concept. An interesting luxury for a man who has spent years building ships that carry raiders to distant shores. "Tell me, Master Shipbuilder, when did you develop this delicate sensitivity to violence?" The question was calculated to expose Leif as a hypocrite, to suggest that his moral awakening was either false or convenient. But it also provided an opportunity to articulate the change that had occurred in his thinking, to make public the transformation that Astrid's presence had catalyzed. "When I was forced to confront the human cost of the work I do," Leif said, his voice steady and clear. "When I met someone whose family was destroyed by raiders sailing in ships I built. When I realized that creating beautiful instruments of war doesn't absolve me of responsibility for how those instruments are used." A murmur ran through the gathered crowd at this admission. Many of the workers had heard pieces of Astrid's story, but this was the first time Leif had publicly acknowledged the connection between his work and specific acts of violence. The confession carried both courage and risk-courage in its honesty, risk in its implications for his business relationships. "Ah yes, the mysterious woman who appeared from nowhere to whisper poison in your ear," Harold said, his gaze seeking out Astrid among the crowd. Thorvald mentioned her in his letters. A survivor of some coastal raid, nursing grievances and seeking someone to blame for her misfortunes. She seeks nothing but the chance to live without being complicit in the kind of violence that destroyed her world, Leif replied. If that makes her dangerous to men like Thorvald, perhaps that says more about Thorvald than it does about her. The challenge was direct and unmistakable, a public repudiation of Thorvald's authority and methods. Harold's expression darkened at the insult to his lord, his hand moving instinctively toward his sword hilt. "You forget yourself, shipbuilder. Jarl Thorvald has been generous with his patronage, patient with your recent eccentricities. But patience has limits, especially when disrespect becomes public defiance." "Then, let me be perfectly clear about where I stand," Leif said, raising his voice so that everyone in the courtyard could hear. "I will no longer build ships designed primarily for warfare. I will no longer accept commissions from men whose primary business is violence against peaceful settlements. And I will no longer pretend that my skills as a craftsman excuse my complicity in the suffering those skills have enabled. The declaration sent a shock through the gathered crowd. Workers exchanged uncertain glances, recognizing that their employer had just severed relationships with many of his most profitable customers. Families whispered urgently about what this might mean for their livelihoods, their security, their futures in this community. Harold's laugh was harsh and without humor. Noble words from a man who has grown rich on the very violence he now claims to oppose. But words don't pay debts or protect households from the consequences of betraying powerful allies. Then what would satisfy Jarl Thorvald's sense of injured honor? Leif asked, what terms would resolve this conflict without requiring me to marry his daughter or compromise my principles? The terms are simple, Harald replied, drawing a scroll from his belt and unrolling it for all to see. Complete fulfillment of your existing obligations, including immediate marriage to Ingrid Thorvaldsteder. Public apology for the insult your refusal has caused to the Iron Wolf clan, and a formal contract ensuring continued cooperation with Thorvald's maritime enterprises for the next 5 years. In other words, total submission. In other words, recognition of reality. You are a craftsman, not a jarl. Your opinions about violence and morality are irrelevant compared to your utility as a shipbuilder. Accept your place in the natural order, and you can continue to prosper under Thorvald's protection. Leif felt the familiar weight of the axe in his hands, remembering the feel of combat, the brutal simplicity of conflicts resolved through strength rather than negotiation. For years, he had tried to avoid such confrontations, using diplomacy and economic leverage to navigate the complex relationships that sustained his business. But some conflicts couldn't be negotiated away. Some choices couldn't be compromised. Harold's terms weren't really terms at all. They were demands for complete capitulation, the abandonment of everything Leif had come to believe about responsibility and moral choice. I refuse, he said simply. Then you choose the hard way. Harold's sword cleared its sheath with a metallic whisper that seemed to echo across the suddenly silent courtyard. By the authority of Jarl Thorvald Ironwolf, I claim this shipyard and all its assets as compensation for the dishonor you have caused his house. Any who stand with you will be considered enemies of the Ironwolf clan. The threat was calculated to isolate Leif from his workers and supporters, to make resistance seem futile by forcing everyone to choose between their loyalty to him and their own survival. In most cases, such tactics were effective. Few people were willing to risk their family's safety for the sake of their employer's principles. But as Harold spoke, something unexpected happened. Instead of backing away from Leif, several of the workers stepped forward, their own tools and weapons appearing in their hands. Bjorn moved to Leif's right side, a heavy carpenter's hammer gripped in his weathered fists. Eric, the young apprentice, whose recovery had established Astrid's reputation, took position on his left with a sharp chisel and a look of determined loyalty. The shipyard belongs to Master Leif, Bjorn said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of age and experience. Anyone who wants to take it will have to go through us first. More workers joined them. Magnus the rope maker with his curved knife, Olaf the blacksmith with his hammer, even some of the younger apprentices who had barely begun to learn their trades. They formed a loose circle around Leif, their makeshift weapons no match for Harold's professional soldiers, but their presence a clear statement of where their loyalties lay. Touching, Harold said, though his expression suggested he was more impressed than he wanted to admit. But ultimately pointless. You're craftsmen, not warriors. Step aside now, and Thorvald might show mercy for your misguided loyalty. We've talked this through, Bjorn replied steadily. We know what we're choosing and why. Master Leif has treated us fairly, paid us well, respected our skills and our families. More than that, he's shown us that there are ways to practice our crafts that don't require us to ignore the harm they might cause. You think your loyalty will protect you from the consequences of defying the Iron Wolf clan. We think our loyalty is worth more than our fear, Eric said, his young voice steady despite the obvious danger. And we think some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible to win. Our soldiers began to advance, their professional formation and superior weapons making the outcome seem inevitable. But as they moved, Astrid stepped out from the crowd of onlookers, moving to stand beside Leif with a calm determination that surprised even her. She carried no weapon except a small knife used for cutting herbs, wore no armor except a green wool dress that Sigrid had given her months earlier. But around her neck hung the Thor's hammer pendant that Leif had given her, and in her eyes was a resolution that spoke of someone who had already lost everything once and was no longer afraid of the prospect of losing it again. "Wait," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the tense courtyard. "Before this goes any further, there's something Harold and his men should know about who they're fighting for." Harold paused, curiosity apparently overcoming his eagerness for violence. "Speak quickly, woman. My patience is not unlimited." "I am Astrid, Eric's daughter of Ravenshollow," she said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. 3 months ago, my village was destroyed by raiders flying the Iron Wolf banner. My parents, my brothers, my betrothed, all of them died defending their homes against warriors who came in ships built in this very shipyard. The revelation sent another ripple through the crowd, connecting the personal tragedy that had brought her here with the larger conflict now unfolding. But Astrid wasn't finished. "I came here seeking answers, perhaps seeking revenge. What I found instead was a man wrestling with the same guilt I carried, trying to find a way to build something better from the wreckage of what we had both lost." She looked directly at Harald, her gaze unwavering. "You ask us to submit to Thorvald's authority, to accept his vision of how the world should work. But his vision created my tragedy, and it will create others like it. How many more villages must burn before we say enough?" Harald's expression had grown thoughtful as she spoke, and when he replied, his tone carried less certainty than before. "The world is what it is, not what we wish it could be. Strong men take from weak ones. That's not cruelty, it's nature." "No," Astrid said firmly. "That's choice. And we're choosing differently." The confrontation hung balanced on the edge of violence, each side committed to positions that seemed to make conflict inevitable. But in that moment of suspension, something shifted in the quality of attention around them. The workers' families, the other craftsmen, even some of Harald's soldiers seemed to be listening not just to the words being spoken, but to the deeper questions they raised about loyalty, responsibility, and the kinds of lives they wanted to live. The axe in Leif's hands no longer felt like just a weapon. It felt like a symbol of the choice between the old ways of resolving conflict and whatever new way they might discover together. The battle that was about to begin would determine more than just who controlled the shipyard. It would test whether their commitment to different values was strong enough to survive the violent opposition it would inevitably face. The broken crown lay in the mud of the shipyard courtyard, its silver bands twisted and its central jewel cracked beyond repair. What had once been the symbol of Thorvald's authority, the ceremonial headpiece Harold wore when acting as his lord's representative, now served as evidence that even the most entrenched power could be shattered when enough people chose to stand against it. The battle had been brief but decisive, resolved not through superior strength, but through the unexpected alliance that formed when several of Harold's own men laid down their weapons rather than continue fighting. The moment of transformation came when Astrid, in the midst of treating wounded fighters from both sides, looked up at one of Thorvald's soldiers and recognized something in his eyes that transcended the conflict they were supposed to be waging. "You don't want to be here," she had said simply. her hand still working to stop the bleeding from a cut on the man's arm. "You don't believe in what you're fighting for." The soldier, a young man not much older than her lost brother, had nodded, slowly, his grip loosening on his sword. "My family lives in a coastal village like yours," he admitted quietly. "I've seen what raids do to innocent people. But service to the Iron Wolf clan pays well, and there aren't many other choices for men with my skills." "There could be other choices," Leif had said, overhearing the exchange while helping Eric bind a sprained wrist. "Not just for you, but for all of us. Ways of using our abilities that don't require us to cause harm to survive." One by one, Harold's soldiers had begun to lower their weapons, not in surrender, but in recognition that the conflict they were fighting served interests they couldn't support once those interests were clearly articulated. The abstract duty of loyalty to their lord became harder to maintain when confronted with the human cost of that loyalty. The specific faces of the people who would suffer from Thorvald's continued dominance. Harold himself had fought to the end, his personal honor bound too tightly to Thorvald's authority to allow for compromise or retreat. But when his own men refused to continue supporting him, when the community he had come to intimidate stood united against his threats, even his considerable skill as a warrior couldn't overcome the mathematics of isolation. The crown broke when he threw it down in frustration, the silver band separating as they struck the frozen ground. The crack that ran through its central stone seemed to symbolize something larger than just damaged jewelry, the fracturing of an entire system of authority based on fear and violence. "This isn't over," Harold said, blood seeping from a cut. Above his eye, his sword finally lowered but not surrendered. "Thorvald won't accept this defiance. He'll come himself next time, with more men, with allies who understand what's at stake." "Let him come," Leif replied, though his voice carried exhaustion as much as defiance. The axe in his hands was stained, with blood not from killing, thankfully, but from the defensive wounds he had taken protecting his workers and their families. "We'll face whatever comes together, as we face this. You think your idealism will protect you from professional warriors? From the combined might of the clans that profit from the current arrangement. I think our idealism gives us something worth fighting for, which is more than Thorvald's men can say." Astrid looked up from bandaging the last of the wounded, her green dress torn and stained, but her expression calm. "And I think you'd be surprised how many people are tired of a system that treats their suffering as the price of other men's prosperity." Harold's laugh was bitter, but it carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been present earlier. "You're starting a war you can't win." "No," Leif said firmly. "We're ending a war that should never have been fought. The war against coastal villages, against fishing communities, against anyone too weak to defend themselves from raiders who profit from violence. And what will you replace it with? How will you survive when the current system collapses? By building something better." Astrid gestured toward the workers who were helping tend the wounded, regardless of which side they had been fighting for. "By creating relationships based on mutual benefit rather than exploitation. By using our skills to connect communities instead of destroying them." Pretty words. But the world doesn't run on pretty words. Then maybe it's time the world learned to run on something else. As Harald and his remaining loyal soldiers prepared to leave, taking word of their defeat back to Thorvald and his allies, the full implications of what had happened began to settle over the shipyard community. They had not simply repelled an attack. They had declared themselves in opposition to the entire economic and social system that had shaped their lives. "What happens now?" Eric asked, his young face showing the mix of excitement and fear that came with participating in something larger than himself. "Do we really think we can build ships for trade instead of war? Find customers who want to connect rather than conquer?" "We have to try," Leif said, looking around at the faces of people who had chosen to stand with him despite the risks. "Not because success is guaranteed, but because the alternative is continuing to be complicit in tragedies like Astrid's family suffered. It won't be easy, Bjorn added, his practical nature asserting itself even in the aftermath of their moral victory. We'll need to find new customers, develop new markets, probably accept smaller profits for work that serves better purposes. But we'll be able to sleep at night, Magnus said quietly, knowing that our work helps people cross dangerous waters safely instead of creating more dangerous waters for them to fear. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of several townspeople, who had watched the confrontation from a distance but were now coming forward to offer support. Among them were merchants who had grown tired of the protection fees demanded by Thorvald's organization, farmers whose crops had been seized to feed raiding expeditions, and families whose sons had been pressed into service for military ventures they didn't support. "If you're serious about this," said Gunnar the grain merchant, a prosperous man whose cooperation had been secured through intimidation rather than mutual benefit, "there are others who would support alternatives to the current arrangement. People who have prospered despite Thorvald's demands rather than because of them." "What kind of support?" Leif asked. "Financial backing for ship construction that serves peaceful purposes. Contracts for vessels designed to carry goods rather than warriors. Introduction to trading partners in distant lands who value craftsmanship over conquest." It was the beginning of an answer to Harald's challenge about replacing the system they were opposing. The support wouldn't be immediate or overwhelming, but it suggested that their vision of an alternative future might be more viable than their enemies claimed. "There's something else," Astrid said, her hand unconsciously touching the Thor's hammer, pendant at her throat. "Something we need to consider if we're really going to challenge the way things have always been done." "What do you mean?" Leif asked. "We can't just build different kinds of ships and hope that solves the larger problem. We need to actively help the victims of the old system, the survivors of raids, and the communities struggling to recover from violence. Otherwise, we're just creating a small island of peace in an ocean of suffering." "You're talking about using our resources to help other people like yourself." "I'm talking about using our resources to prove that there are better ways to live, better ways to resolve conflicts, better ways to build prosperity than through conquest and exploitation." The proposal was ambitious, probably dangerous, and almost certainly expensive. But it also represented the logical extension of the principles they had been discussing, the practical application of their commitment to reducing harm rather than simply avoiding complicity in it. "How would that work?" Eric asked. "Rescue ships for coastal communities under threat. Supplies and materials for rebuilding after raids. Safe passage for refugees seeking new homes." Astrid's voice grew stronger as she spoke, her vision taking shape. "And maybe, eventually, active intervention when we learn of planned attacks against peaceful settlements." "You're describing a private navy dedicated to protecting the weak instead of serving the strong," Bjorn observed. "Is that so impossible?" "It's never been tried, at least not on any significant scale." "Then, maybe it's time someone tried it." As the day faded into evening and the community began the work of cleaning up after the confrontation, the broken crown remained in the courtyard, mud not as a trophy of their victory, but as a reminder of what they had committed themselves to opposing. The silver bands that had once held it together lay separated, scattered, no longer capable of supporting the authority they had represented. But scattered around those broken pieces were other symbols, the tools that workers had used to defend their principles, the bandages that had bound wounds regardless of which side had inflicted them, and the Thor's hammer pendant that caught the last light of day as Astrid moved among the wounded, offering comfort and healing to anyone who needed it. The old order, represented by Thorvald's crown, had been built on the premise that strength took from weakness, that some people's prosperity required other people's suffering. The new order they were trying to create rested on different premises, that strength could protect weakness, That prosperity could be shared rather than hoarded. That the skills used to create instruments of destruction could be redirected toward tools of preservation and growth. Whether their vision would survive the challenges ahead remained to be seen. But as night fell over the shipyard and families gathered to tend their wounded and celebrate their survival, there was reason to hope that something better than what had come before might be possible. The broken crown would be melted down and reforged, its silver transformed into fittings for ships designed to carry healing rather than harm, connection rather than conquest. And in that transformation, perhaps, lay the promise of all the other transformations their victory had made possible. The new ship's nameplate gleamed in the morning sunlight, its carved letters spelling out Astrid's hope in the elegant script that had become Leif's signature style. The vessel itself was unlike anything that had slid down the ways of his shipyard, sleek and swift like his warships, but fitted out for rescue and relief rather than raid and conquest. Where other longships carried weapons racks and shield walls, this one held medical supplies and emergency provisions. Where others bore the fierce dragon heads designed to strike terror, this one was adorned with symbols of protection and healing. 6 months had passed since the confrontation with Harald and his soldiers. 6 months during which their small community had learned to live with the consequences of their choice to oppose Thorvald's authority. The learning had not been easy. 3 attempted raids on the shipyard had been repelled, though not without cost in wounded defenders and damaged property. Several of their former customers had taken their business elsewhere, forcing difficult adjustments to household budgets and work schedules. But other changes had been more encouraging. The grain merchant Gunnar had been joined by a growing network of traders and craftsmen who preferred conducting business without the protection, fees and loyalty oaths demanded by the traditional clan system. Ships built in Leif's yard now carried goods to Saxon kingdoms and Slavic trading posts, opening new markets for peaceful commerce that proved surprisingly profitable. Most significantly, word of their stand had spread to other coastal communities, attracting refugees and survivors who brought skills, knowledge, and determination to help build alternatives to the violent world they had escaped. The shipyard had grown from a purely Norse operation into something more cosmopolitan, where different languages and traditions mingled in pursuit of common goals. Astrid stood beside Leif on the launching platform, watching as the workers made final preparations for Astrid's hope to taste salt water for the first time. The ship represented more than just another completed commission. It was the physical embodiment of the promise they had made to use their abilities in service of healing rather than harm. Nervous? Leif asked, noting the way her hands twisted in the fabric of her cloak. Hopeful, she replied, though her voice carried undertones of uncertainty, and frightened that we might be attempting something beyond our capabilities. The ship's maiden voyage would take it north along the coast, following reports of coastal raids that had left several fishing villages in desperate need of medical supplies and rebuilding materials. It would be the first real test of whether their vision of rescue and relief work could function in the practical world of dangerous seas and hostile politics. Eric will command her well, Leif said, gesturing toward the young man who had grown from apprentice carpenter to ship's captain in the months since choosing to stand with them against Harald's threats. And the crew we've assembled has experience with both seamanship and the kind of work we're asking them to do. The crew was itself a symbol of the changes their community had undergone. Half were experienced Norse sailors attracted by the prospect of using their skills for something other than raiding. The other half were survivors of raids who had learned seamanship the hard way by necessity as refugees fleeing violence across dangerous waters. Together, they formed a team uniquely qualified for the rescue work that Astrid's Hope was designed to perform. Launch when ready, Leif called out, and the workers began the careful process of releasing the ship from her building cradle. The vessel slid down the greased ways with the grace that had always marked Leif's craftsmanship. But this time, the crowd that gathered to watch cheered not for a new instrument of war, but for a tool of salvation. As Astrid's hope settled into the harbor water, and her crew began the process of stepping her mast and setting her rigging, Astrid felt a complex mix of emotions. Pride in what they had accomplished, certainly, but also awareness of how much work remained to be done. One ship, however well-designed and noble in purpose, could not undo the damage caused by decades of violence and exploitation. "It's a beginning," she said, as much to herself as to Leif. "All great changes start with small beginnings," he replied. "Your mother's healing knowledge began with learning to treat simple cuts and grew into wisdom that has saved dozens of lives in our community. Alone, my father's boat-building skills started with repairing fishing nets and developed into the craftsmanship that now serves peaceful purposes." The reference to their parents reminded Astrid of how far she had traveled, both literally and emotionally, since washing ashore in this foreign port. The woman who had begged for scraps while harboring thoughts of revenge would barely recognize the person she had become, someone who had found purpose in healing, love in unexpected places, and hope in the possibility of building something better from the wreckage of what had been destroyed. "Do you think they would be proud?" she asked. "Our families, I mean, of what we've chosen to do. I think they would understand that we're trying to honor their memories by ensuring that other families don't suffer as we have suffered," Leif said quietly. "And I think they would recognize that love, whether for family or for each other, requires us to protect what we cherish, even when that protection demands difficult choices." The mention of love between them was still new enough to feel precious. Fragile as spring ice, but growing stronger with each shared challenge. They had not spoken formal vows or exchanged traditional promises, but their partnership had evolved into something that transcended simple companionship or mutual convenience. They were bound now by shared purpose, mutual respect, and the kind of deep affection that grows when two people choose to face uncertainty together rather than seeking safety apart. "The council meeting this afternoon," Astrid said, changing the subject to more immediate concerns. "Do you think the other communities will agree to coordinate their defense efforts?" "Some will. The smaller fishing villages understand that cooperation is their best protection against raiders. The larger settlements ... Leif shrugged. "They may still believe they can purchase security through traditional alliances." The meeting represented another test of their evolving vision. Instead of trying to convince individual communities to resist Thorvald's demands separately, they were proposing a coordinated network of mutual support, shared intelligence about threatening activities, coordinated responses to attacks, and joint investment in the kind of rescue and relief capabilities that Astrid's hope represented. "Thorvald hasn't been idle while we've been building ships and treating wounded," Astrid observed. "His alliance with the Grimskull clan gives him access to more warriors and ships than he had before. But it also makes him more predictable. Larger forces move more slowly, leave more obvious signs of their intentions. And the alliance requires him to share profits and decision-making with allies who may not share his willingness to take risks." It was a strategic assessment that reflected how much both of them had learned about the political and military dimensions of their conflict. One had begun as a personal dispute over a refused marriage, had evolved into something approaching organized resistance to the entire system of clan-based exploitation that shaped their world. "Whatever happens," Astrid said, watching as Astrid's Hope's crew began testing her sail configuration, "we've proven that alternatives are possible. Even if our specific efforts fail, the example might inspire others to find their own ways of refusing to accept violence as inevitable." "You sound like you're preparing for defeat." "I'm preparing for the possibility that our victory might look different than we expected. That success might mean planting seeds that other people harvest, rather than seeing immediate transformation of everything we oppose. The philosophical discussion was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger bearing urgent news from the north. The young woman's face was flushed with exertion and worry, her clothes showing the effects of hard travel and difficult conditions. "Ships," she gasped, accepting the cup of water that Leif offered. 3 long ships flying the Wolf banner, heading south along the coast. They're not moving like raiders, too organized, too purposeful. More like they're hunting for something specific. "How far north?" Astrid asked. 2 days' sail, maybe less if the wind holds. And there are signs that more ships are gathering at Thorvald's main base. Something big is being planned. The news crystallized their situation in ways that months of speculation and preparation had not. Thorvald was no longer content with economic pressure or diplomatic isolation. He was preparing for direct confrontation, bringing sufficient force to overwhelm any resistance their small community might offer. "Time to test whether our allies are willing to do more than attend meetings and make promises," Leif said grimly. "If Thorvald is coming in force, we'll need every ship and every fighter we can gather. And time to discover whether our different approach to conflict can survive contact with his traditional one." Astrid added as the afternoon wore on, and the community prepared for what might be their final test. Astrid found herself drawn repeatedly to the sight of Astrid's Hope riding at anchor in the harbor. The ship represented so much of what they had been trying to achieve: beauty in service of healing, skill applied to protection rather than destruction, hope that different choices could lead to different outcomes. Whether that hope would survive the coming storm remained to be seen. But as the sun began to set over water that would soon carry either their salvation or their destruction, Astrid felt a peace that surprised her. They had chosen their path with open eyes and committed hearts. They had built something worth defending, and attracted people worth defending it with. The nameplate on their ship's bow would gleam in tomorrow's battle light, carrying its message of hope into whatever future their choices had made possible. And in that gleaming, perhaps, lay all the victory they could ask for: the knowledge that they had refused to accept the world as they found it, and had worked to leave it better than they had discovered it. The new ship rocked gently in the harbor, ready for whatever service awaited her, while around her, the community she represented prepared to prove that hope, carefully crafted and courageously defended, could be stronger than the forces arrayed against it.